The story of the Van der Linde gang is, in the truest sense, an American tragedy written in dust, blood, and fading ink. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a chosen family chasing freedom while civilization closes in around them. From its humble beginnings in the chaotic 1870s to its shattered remnants in the mechanized early 1900s, this outlaw band becomes the living embodiment of a country at war with its own soul. On the surface, it is the tale of Dutch, Hosea, Arthur, and John. But beneath the gunfights and train robberies, every inch of this world is quietly testifying against them. The world was changing. Railroads carved through valleys, telegraph wires stitched towns together, and factories rose where open plains once stood. The old ways were dying, and Rockstar hides that slow death in places most riders gallop past. A headline about new federal agencies, a factory whistle echoing over Annisburg, a stranger muttering about investment opportunities as the gang huddles around a dwindling campfire. This is a story of binary collisions, idealism versus reality, loyalty versus betrayal, wild freedom versus creeping order. Dutch's grand philosophy of resistance is painted not just in speeches but in the details. His early outfits are sharp, tailored, almost theatrical, a man who believes he can bend the world to his will. By Beaver Hollow, the colors darken, the grooming slips, and the costume itself becomes a record of decay, a visual ledger of every broken promise and every lost soul following him into the mud. The camps tell the same story. Horseshoe Overlook is open and airy, crates neatly stacked, tents arranged with a sense of purpose. Clemens Point grows more cluttered. Shady Bell is a decaying mansion haunted by mildew and memory, and Beaver Hollow is a damp, suffocating cave where people sleep on bare ground. Each move marks a step down, from hope to hunger, from family to fracture, from a roaming caravan to a cornered animal. Every tent reflects a mind, Arthur's practical and worn, Hosea's scattered with books and plans. Micah's creeping closer to Dutch's fire as his influence spreads. From the very beginning, the gang is doomed, and the game quietly admits it. Arthur's journal shifts from admiring sketches of Dutch as a heroic figure to bitter, cramped notes about paranoia and betrayal. Graveyards appear long before the credits roll, lonely markers on windswept hills that already spell out the final roll call. Even the newspapers in Saint Denis hint at a future where outlaws are replaced by corporations and government agents, where men like Dutch are not legends, but relics. This video traces that entire hidden history. By the end, the Van der Linde gang will no longer be just mission givers and cutscenes, but a fully documented saga etched into outfits, camp layouts, bounty posters, and forgotten letters. Every scrap of paper, every whispered conversation, every changing town will take its place in the larger tapestry, revealing how a dream of freedom became a cautionary tale about progress, power, and the price of believing a man who insists he has a plan. The story begins not with a robbery, but with two con men meeting in a world that does not yet know it has already outgrown them. Two men trying to rob each other in a cramped hotel room is more than a funny origin for an outlaw legend. It is the blueprint for everything that follows, from its humble beginnings in that failed con. This video will reconstruct the entire lore of the Van der Linde gang, using the quiet evidence Rockstar scattered in every corner of its world. This is not just a march through missions or a recap of robberies. It is a forensic reading of camp objects left on tables, of ambient conversations half heard by the fire, of newspapers crumpled in the mud and journals filled with doubt. Every tent, every outfit, every grave, every scrap of paper will be treated as testimony, the living embodiment of a family that believed it could outrun civilization. The story will be told from the very beginning, when Dutch and Hosea first crossed paths in the 18s, 70s, all the way to the final bullets and lonely headstones that close out Red Dead Redemption 2 and echo into Red Dead Redemption 1. From their first shared trick on a mark, to Blackwater, to Beecher's Hope, the chronology will be clear, the timeline unbroken, the rise and fall seen in full. Along the way, hidden details will quietly fill in the emotional and ideological history of every core member. Arthur's journal drawings will shift from idealistic sketches of Dutch as a hero to bitter, cramped notes that read more like a confession than a diary. Dutch's wardrobe will darken and unravel as his philosophy does the same. His once careful grooming giving way to a man who has started to believe his own delusions. Even Micah's growing pile of possessions at camp will betray his influence long before the open betrayal arrives. The structure will mirror the gang's life. First, the rise, the early cons, the first camps, the dream of freedom that feels almost pure. Then the golden years when money flows, laughter carries across Horseshoe Overlook and Clements Point, and the world seems just distant enough to ignore. After that, the fractures, Blackwater's shadow, the St. Denis disaster, the slow poisoning at Shady Bell and Beaver Hollow, as the old ways were dying and no one dared admit it. At key moments, the narrative will pause and zoom in. A scrap of dialogue near a campfire, a forgotten grave on a windswept hill, a changing bounty poster, or a town's nervous whisper about those Vanderlinde people. What do these details reveal that the characters never say outright? How do they show loyalty curdling into betrayal, dreams collapsing into fear? To understand every hidden detail, it is necessary first to understand how this family was born. Because in this story of outlaws and civilization, Rockstar hides the gang's fate in the way their story begins, with a con, a philosophy, and two men who believed the world was changing fast enough that they could rewrite its rules. So it begins not with blood on the floor, but with two guns pointed under a table and two men trying to rob the same mark at the same time. The very beginning of the Vanderlinde gang is, in the truest sense, a joke that gets out of hand. Dutch and Hosea meet as rival conmen, each convinced he is the cleverest outlaw in the room, each absolutely certain the other is just another victim. Rockstar lets this meet-cute crime story drift through the game as a half-remembered legend. Dutch tells it with theatrical flair by the campfire, painting himself as the living embodiment of charm and danger, the man who saw through Hosea in a heartbeat. Hosea, sitting nearby, quietly corrects the details, reminding Dutch who actually had the drop on whom, and how close they both came to dying over a simple pocketbook swindle. Their bickering has the rhythm of an old married couple. Two future architects of violence, framed as a comedy duo. From its humble beginnings, that story spreads through the camp until it becomes a family myth. Arthur hears it as a boy, and later writes fragments in his journal, sketching the scene with a mixture of awe and amusement. Other gang members repeat the tale, each adding a flourish. Bill swears Dutch never flinched. Javier insists Hosea was smiling even with a gun in his ribs. The details shift, but the tone stays the same. It is playful, witty, strangely wholesome, a story of how laughter beat out lead for once in a world that rarely offers that mercy. Within that one incident, early character thumbnails come into focus. Dutch is charismatic and theatrical, intoxicated by big ideas about freedom and civilization, already turning a botched robbery into a parable about destiny. Hosea is charming but grounded, a conman who reads people, sees the angles Dutch ignores, and understands that survival often depends on knowing when not to pull the trigger. One dreams aloud, the other quietly counts exits. The turning point is simple and profound. Both men realize, almost at the same moment, that they are the same kind of man, too proud to back down, too curious to walk away, too ambitious to stay small time. Instead of firing, they start laughing. In that laughter is a decision, never fully spoken, but always understood, that together they can be more than drifting thieves. They can build something. A gang. A family. A philosophy. Yet that first shared joke carries a shadow. The choice to talk instead of shoot, to improvise instead of retreat, becomes their pattern and their curse. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and the charm that saves them at a saloon table will one day fail them on a Blackwater dock and a St. Denis street. The game buries this warning in campfire stories and Arthur's later reflections, hinting that the same easy confidence that created the gang will help destroy it. Because if their beginning is a joke that turns into a family, what happens when the laughter finally runs out? The laughter fades, but in its place Dutch offers something even more intoxicating than a good joke. A philosophy. From its humble beginnings, the gang is held together less by money than by words, by the way Dutch can turn a campfire into a pulpit and a robbery into a cause. In the very beginning, his talk of freedom, family, and fighting a corrupt civilization becomes the gang's scripture. Arthur's journal quietly confirms this. Early pages sketch Dutch as a hero, almost the living embodiment of the noble outlaw, coat flaring, eyes bright, speech about the world changing captured in admiring ink. Arthur writes of Dutch's plans, Dutch's vision, Dutch's promise that they are not common thieves, but men and women standing against a rigged system. On paper, it reads as a story of resistance, of dreams held up against the encroaching railroads and telegraph wires. Yet Rockstar threads in small betrayals of that idealistic image. Listen closely in camp, and Dutch's lofty words keep brushing against petty hypocrisies. He condemns the rich for bleeding the poor, then has no problem taking a widow's last savings if the moment suits him. He claims not to care for praise, but lingers when the gang compliments his speeches, soaking in their admiration. Even the camp layouts betray him. Dutch always claims the highest ground, the best view, the position every eye must cross, as if freedom still needs a throne. Hosea sits just off to the side of that throne. He believes in Dutch, but his belief is cautious, worn at the edges by hard winters and failed scores. His tent is smaller, quieter, more practical, a man's shelter rather than a stage. In early conversations, he tempers Dutch's rhetoric with reminders of food, ammunition, Pinkertons. Where Dutch talks about the old ways we're dying, Hosea talks about surviving long enough to see tomorrow. Together they form a delicate balance, the dreamer and the realist, one building castles in the air, the other checking the ground beneath them for cracks. Around them, the gang becomes part family, part utopian experiment. Campfire songs drift over shared chores, children play between rifles and washing lines, and the donation box stands as a totem of communal loyalty. They invent their own code on the fringes of civilization, strict when it flatters them, flexible enough to bend whenever the right score appears. Are they protectors or predators who tell themselves a kinder story? Beyond the campfire's glow, the world answers. Newspapers brand them butchers and terrorists. NPCs in towns whisper about massacres and robberies. Bounty posters reduce their philosophy to a price on a wall. To the outside world, they are criminals. Within their own bubble, they are freedom fighters, convinced history will vindicate them. That tragic gap between self-image and reputation is the seed of everything to come. And as Dutch's words grow grander and the camps grow poorer, that seed is already starting to sprout. That gap between image and reality is not only written in wanted posters and rumors, it is written in Arthur Morgan's own hand. From its humble beginnings, the gang's history is quietly sketched in the margins of the world, and the truest record of Dutch's dream is not a speech or a headline, but a battered leather journal. In the very beginning, those pages are almost devotional. Arthur's early entries about Dutch are warm, admiring, almost childlike, for a man who has already killed and bled. He draws Dutch standing tall against the sky, coat flaring, hand raised as if delivering a sermon to the horizon. The line work is confident and clean, the shading careful, as though every stroke must do justice to the man who saved a lost soul from the gallows. On the page, Dutch is the living embodiment of the philosophy he preaches: freedom, family, resistance to a corrupt civilization. Arthur's words match the drawings. He writes about Dutch with a reverence usually reserved for prophets and fathers, describing him as a good man with fine ideals, convinced their outlaw life can still be honorable. The language is hopeful, almost romantic, full of talk about giving people a better world and striking back at those who have taken everything. These passages function as a secret ledger of belief, a story of how convincing Dutch's ideals once were, not just to impressionable recruits, but to the hardened enforcer who carries out his will. That idealism is not confined to ink. It shapes the physical spaces the gang calls home. At Horseshoe Overlook and later at Clemens Point, Arthur's journal mentions Dutch's speeches around the fire, and those speeches echo the layout of camp itself. Dutch's tent is always central and slightly elevated, positioned so that conversations naturally flow up to him, not across. Every path in camp, every line of sight from the wagons, subtly points toward that canvas throne. Is it coincidence, or architecture as ideology? Within these same pages, the gang's code is laid out with equal certainty. No unnecessary killing, protect women and children, steal from the rich, never from those who have nothing. Arthur writes these rules as if they are unshakable truths, the thing that separates them from the brutal world closing in. In the journal, they are not marketing or self-justification, they are commandments, written in plain, steady script, believed in the truest sense. Yet Rockstar hides a darker trick in that notebook. Flip from those early, confident portraits to the later sketches, and Dutch's dream can be seen rotting in real time. The line work grows harsher, the poses slump, the handwriting phrase as the world was changing and the old ways were dying. The journal begins as scripture. It will end as an autopsy. The only question is when the ink turns from devotion to doubt, and what has to break before Arthur finally writes the truth. Arthur's ink turns sour just as the camp itself begins to feel strangely sweet. For a brief window at Horseshoe Overlook, the Van der Linde gang becomes the living embodiment of Dutch's promise, a family carved out of a hostile world, a little outlaw commune clinging to the edge of civilization. The story in this chapter does not begin with gunfire. It begins with music. Fiddle tunes by the fire, Javier strumming a guitar, Karen and Mary Beth laughing too loud after a bottle of stolen whiskey. Morning brings a different rhythm. Pearson's bell calling everyone to stew, men hauling water, women hanging laundry. Shared meals where outlaws complain about chores as if they were farmers. From its humble beginnings on that cliffside, the camp feels less like a gang's hideout and more like a fragile village, a story of freedom, family, and routine pretending to be normal life. Horseshoe Overlook itself is a manifesto pitched in canvas and wood. Dutch's tent sits at the heart, raised on a little platform, draped with rugs, lanterns, and bright fabrics that insist this is culture, not squalor. Shelves of books, a chessboard, maps pinned and repinned across a folding table, his philosophy laid out in paper and ink, as if the right arrangement of ideas could hold back the world. Hosea's space, just across the way, is quieter. A modest bedroll, a few personal trinkets, a small chest for clothes and tools. Dutch lives in symbols, Hosea lives in necessities. Around them, the layout preaches shared labor and shared fate. Communal tables for eating and card games, crafting benches where ammunition, tonics, and satchels are made not only for one man, but for the group. The camp becomes a story of parallel lives, an idealistic leader drawing lines on maps, and a community hammering, sewing, cooking, and cleaning to make those lines mean something. NPC routines make this philosophy feel real in the truest sense. Pearson stirs the stew but grumbles about needing meat, turning every hunt into a contribution to the whole. Susan Grimshaw patrols the grounds, enforcing chores with the severity of a small-town sheriff. The women scrub clothes by the river, gossiping about civilization and its hypocrisies. Jack runs between tents, chased by Uncle's half-hearted scolding, while Charles quietly carves by the fire. Who among them truly chose this life, and who simply had nowhere else to go? Every background animation whispers the same answer. Each is a lost soul the world refused. Then there is the donation box and ledger, the most honest piece of Dutch's utopia. Money and valuables flow into a simple lockbox, and in return the camp grows, better tents, improved medicine, ammunition, a new hitching post. Dutch praises generosity, calls it loyalty, and the mechanics turn contribution into belief. The player is bound into the philosophy without a speech, help the collective, watch it flourish, feel responsible for its survival. But this system also plants a quiet seed of dread. The same ledger that records prosperity will one day track absence. The same benches will stand empty, the same box will gather dust. Those empty seats at the fire, those abandoned tents, will say more about betrayal and decay than any monologue Dutch ever delivers. For now, though, the camp still sings. The question is how long a dream this delicate can survive once the world starts pushing back. For the camp to feel this warm, something colder had to come before it. The story of Arthur Morgan begins long before the Van der Linde firelight, in cramped rooms and muddy streets, in the shadow of a man who taught him all the wrong lessons about the world. From its humble beginnings, Arthur's life is a catalogue of absence. His mother dies when he is young. His father, Lyle Morgan, is a petty outlaw drifting from scheme to scheme, dragging a boy in his wake. There are hints of this scattered through Arthur's journal, rough sketches of faceless men in shackles, half-finished lines about Pa that trail off into ink blots. The very beginning of his story is not romance or adventure. It is neglect. At some point, the law finally catches up. Arthur watches his father arrested, chained, and hauled away, a scene he later mentions only in brief, guarded fragments. No flashback cutscene spells it out. Rockstar buries it in throwaway dialogue by a campfire, or in a single journal page where Arthur notes that Lyle died in a chain gang. One line, but it explains everything. The first man Arthur ever tries to follow ends his life as a number on a ledger. In that world, crime does not arrive as a thrilling choice. It arrives as the only language spoken at home. Stealing, lying, running from civilization's rules become the basic grammar of survival. A boy who never learns another tongue grows into a man fluent only in violence and intimidation. Is it any surprise that when authority finally appears in his life, in the form of Dutch and Hosea, he clings to it? Rockstar makes that vulnerability visible in the smallest moments. When Arthur talks about his childhood, his voice drops, the drawl tightens, sentences shrink to blunt, self-deprecating phrases. He calls himself an angry little bastard, dismisses his own pain with a shrug. His body closes up, he looks away, fidgets, changes the subject. Yet when he remembers Dutch and Hosea taking him in at 14, everything softens. The tone warms, the lines get longer, he almost sounds idealistic again. The contrast is the living embodiment of what Dutch represents to him. Arthur does not merely join a gang. In the truest sense, he is adopted into a philosophy. Dutch tells him that their outlaw life is not random cruelty, but a stand against a corrupt civilization where the old ways were dying. Hosea teaches him to read, to hunt, to think beyond petty robbery. Dutch promises that his violence can serve something larger, almost noble. For a boy who watched his father die in chains, what could be more intoxicating than a man who says those chains are the real crime? Arthur becomes Dutch's proof of concept. If this broken, half-feral teenager can grow into a loyal, principled man under Dutch's guidance, then surely the dream works. Or so Arthur believes. The tragedy is that the same loyalty that saves him will one day be the weapon used against him. And as the gang's fortunes rise, another boy will arrive, carrying his own scars, ready to be shaped by the same promise. That promise begins in the snow. Before the big scores, before the speeches and betrayals, there is a half-frozen teenager on the road, and two outlaws who see something in him that the rest of the world has already thrown away. Arthur Morgan is 15 when Dutch and Hosea find him, though the word hardly captures it. His father is dead, his mother gone, his future narrowed to petty crime and an early grave. Dutch takes one look at this angry, half-starved boy and sees potential. Hosea sees danger, but also a mirror of Dutch's own younger self. From its humble beginnings, this is a story of a lost soul given not just food and shelter, but an identity, a banner, a family. Dutch moves first. He talks to Arthur, not down at him. He asks about his past, his dreams, his anger. He offers a philosophy to wrap around that anger, a way to turn rage at civilization into something that feels noble. Freedom, he says, is being your own man. The gang is more than criminals. It is, in the truest sense, resistance. For a boy who has never been believed in, Dutch's attention is intoxicating. Hosea fills the other side of the equation. Where Dutch gives ideas, Hosea gives methods. He teaches Arthur to read marks in a saloon, to watch hands, eyes, posture. He shows him how to plan a con, how to hunt, how to walk away from a bad job even when pride screams to push on. In a world where the old ways were dying, Hosea teaches the old ways of survival, patience, caution, humor in the face of danger. Dutch dreams, Hosea calculates. Arthur's journal quietly preserves this split. Early entries repeat Dutch's phrases almost word for word. As if the boy is trying them on, we're going to make a world where folk can live free. Whole pages are devoted to Dutch's speeches, underlined, admired. Then, between them, there are sketches. Hosea by a campfire, Hosea gutting a deer, Hosea standing beside Arthur on a ridge, pointing out tracks in the snow. Few words, but steady lines. Two mentors, two languages, filling different holes in the same heart. Very quickly, Arthur becomes more than just another recruit. Dutch calls him son without hesitation. Hosea trusts him with delicate work, with planning, with keeping the younger members in line. He is praised for his loyalty, for his steadiness, for being the living embodiment of what Dutch claims the gang can do, take broken people and turn them into something better. How could he not believe? Yet even here, from the very beginning, the seeds of a fracture are being planted. Dutch's philosophy grows more grand, more abstract. Hosea remains grounded, skeptical, quietly mocking the more theatrical flourishes. Arthur stands between them, torn between idealism and reality, between freedom and civilization. Which father does he follow when their paths finally diverge? Which version of the dream survives when the next boy arrives, and the snow gives way to blood? From the very beginning, Arthur is not just another gun in Dutch's army. He is the ledger, ink and blood. Every choice, every hesitation, every quiet doubt is written into him long before it explodes into open betrayal. In a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, Arthur becomes the living embodiment of the gang's conscience. Rockstar never announces this. Instead, the game quietly turns Arthur into the lens through which Dutch's philosophy is judged. His journal starts almost reverent, full of idealistic sketches of campfires, hunts, and Dutch framed as a towering figure promising freedom from civilization's chains. Early entries praise the family Dutch built, repeating his rhetoric almost word for word. But as the gang moves from its humble beginnings in Coulter to Horseshoe Overlook and beyond, the handwriting tightens, the sentences harden, and admiration gives way to questions. The world was changing. Arthur's ink records that change before anyone speaks it aloud. In the early missions, this inner record matches his actions. Arthur enforces the gang's code in the truest sense. He spares witnesses when he can, reins in Bill's temper, pushes back when Micah leans toward cruelty for its own sake. During debt collection, his disgust is palpable when things go too far, and in camp, NPCs quietly acknowledge it. Pearson praises him as dependable. Abigail calls him fair. Even Dutch, in calmer moments, calls Arthur the one he can trust to do things right, a backhanded admission that a line still exists. That line is tested not only in missions, but in the way the world responds. Townsfolk greet Arthur differently depending on his honor. A high honor Arthur is welcomed with nods, warm greetings, and reluctant respect, while a low honor Arthur draws mutters, fear, and open hostility. Ambient conversations in Valentine and Saint Denis mention the gang as either folk devils or rough men with a strange code. The honor system is not just a mechanic, it is a barometer of how far Dutch's grand story has drifted from reality, echoed again in Arthur's changing tone on the page. The journal drawings become hidden emotional telemetry. Early sketches of Dutch show him upright, sharply dressed, surrounded by light shading and hopeful language about plans and better days. After Blackwater, after Rhodes, after the Saint Denis Bank, the lines grow darker, the posture slumps or turns away, and hopeful captions disappear. Where once Arthur wrote of Dutch's philosophy, he begins to write of Dutch's temper. Where once Dutch filled the frame, illness and doubt begin to crowd in. Follow Arthur's inner life closely, and the gang's fate is already written before Beaver Hollow, before the final rides, before the gunsmoke clears. The old ways were dying long before Dutch admitted it. The question is not when the gang falls apart on paper, but when Arthur finally accepts what his own hand has been trying to tell him all along. While Arthur's doubts grow slowly, almost reluctantly, John Marston's skepticism is baked in from the very beginning. His presence turns the gang's campfire conversations into something sharper, less comfortable. A reminder that Dutch's dream is not the only way a lost soul can answer a brutal world. John's story starts in an institution, not on the open plain. Abandoned to an orphanage after his parents' deaths, he grows up under the fists and belts of men who preach discipline but practice cruelty. The place is meant to civilize him, to turn a wild boy into a proper citizen, yet every beating, every locked door only teaches that civilization can be another word for sanctioned abuse. Those fragments of memory, shared in quiet conversations in Red Dead Redemption 2 and echoed later in Red Dead Redemption, sketch a childhood where freedom is something glimpsed through barred windows. Eventually, he runs. Hunger becomes his first real teacher. Starvation, cold nights, and the constant threat of being dragged back harden him, in ways Arthur never quite understands. John learns to steal before he learns to shave, to threaten before he trusts, to throw the first punch because waiting for mercy has already failed him. In the truest sense, his philosophy is survival stripped to the bone. Why believe in grand speeches when the stomach is empty? That desperation leaves a mark. Where Arthur can still be moved by Dutch's rhetoric about changing the world, John hears echoes of wardens and preachers promising order and purpose if he just obeys. He becomes suspicious of anyone claiming to have a grand plan for his life, anyone who says his suffering will be redeemed by some higher goal. Is it really freedom if someone else is writing the script? When Dutch and Hosea eventually cross paths with the teenage thief, the pattern repeats. Another boy alone, another bruised face, another opportunity for Dutch to cast himself as savior. From its humble beginnings, the gang has been a story of broken children gathered under one man's philosophy, and John fits the mold perfectly. Dutch offers him exactly what he offered Arthur: family, education, a future where his violence serves a noble cause instead of a prison sentence. To Dutch, John is the living embodiment of his belief that outlaws can be remade into heroes by the right mentor. But Rockstar draws a clear line between the two surrogate sons. John arrives more sarcastic, quicker with a barbed comment, openly doubtful of Dutch's long speeches around the fire. Where Arthur leans forward, hungry for meaning, John leans back, arms crossed, giving loyalty in practice but rarely in language. He robs, rides, and kills for the gang, yet keeps a part of himself walled off. An inner room Dutch never fully enters. That quiet resistance simmers for years in background dialogue, in sideways glances and half-muttered remarks. As the world was changing and the old ways were dying, Arthur wrestles with betrayal of a dream he once believed in. John, by contrast, wrestles with the question of whether he ever truly believed at all. That tension between the believer and the skeptic riding under the same banner will matter when the Pinkertons close in and Dutch's mask finally slips. Because when the family Dutch built begins to fracture, the boy who never fully surrendered his soul will be the one forced to live with what remains. That fracture runs straight through the gang's two surrogate brothers. From its humble beginnings, the Van der Linde family is built around a quiet rivalry. Arthur Morgan, the dutiful believer, and John Marston, the reluctant heir who never fully bends the knee. Arthur embraces Dutch's philosophy in the truest sense. Dutch talks about freedom, about civilization as a cage, about their world as a story of resistance against a rigged system, and Arthur nods, listens. Absorbs, he wants Dutch's approval, wants to be the living embodiment of the gang's ideals, even when those ideals are already curdling into delusions. John, by contrast, wants the warmth of the fire and the spoils of the robbery, but he questions the sermon, drifts away, disappears for months when Abigail and Jack become inconvenient burdens. In camp, this difference turns into constant, needling tension. Around the Horseshoe Overlook fire, Arthur teases John for running off, calling him a goddamn fool for leaving Abigail to fend for herself. At Clement's Point, their arguments about responsibility spill into the open, with Arthur snapping that John only shows up when there is money on the table, never when the family needs him. The rivalry is not just about pride, it is about what kind of man survives when the old ways were dying. Arthur's journal captures that evolution with brutal honesty. Early entries paint John as childish and unreliable, a lost soul who ran away from the people who saved him. Arthur sketches him with hard lines and harder words, dismissing his attempts at domesticity with Abigail as half-hearted. But as the gang sinks toward Beaver Hollow, the tone shifts. Arthur grudgingly admits John is trying, notes how he worries about Jack, how he pushes back against Dutch not out of selfishness, but out of fear for his family. The drawings soften, the sentences lengthen. Respect replaces contempt. Slowly, painfully, Rockstar reinforces this contrast through mission design. Time and again, Arthur is sent to clean up John's messes, dragging him out of trouble in Valentine, covering his reckless charges in Saint Denis, riding into danger because John went too far or not far enough. Yet when Dutch orders John left behind in the chaos of Saint Denis, it is Arthur who hesitates, who feels the first real crack between loyalty to Dutch and loyalty to the man he once dismissed as a coward. Whose life matters more, the prophet or the skeptic who still has a child waiting at camp? Beneath those choices lies quiet foreshadowing. The entire Red Dead Redemption saga hinges on this relationship, on the believer who burns out and the skeptic who endures. Every journal line, every camp argument, every mission where Arthur shields John from Dutch's worst impulses is preparing the torch handoff. The gang's legacy will not end with the man who wrote its story in pencil and blood. It will end with the man forced to live with the ashes. And when the moment finally comes, that choice will not happen in a grand speech, but on a mountainside, with the world changing below them. On that mountainside, the torch begins to pass, but the fractures that make it possible were there from the very beginning. John's doubt is not a sudden revelation in the snow or the mud. It is a slow, grinding resistance to a man who built his kingdom on gratitude, dependence, and the promise of freedom. Dutch's great talent is collecting the broken. Arthur, found as a boy after his father's death. John, picked up half-starved and half-feral. Javier, a revolutionary exile. Bill, a disgraced soldier. Each one a lost soul, pulled into a philosophy that promises family instead of prison, meaning instead of aimless violence. That is the story Dutch tells. He saved them, therefore they owe him. His authority is the living embodiment of that debt. Arthur leans into it. He writes in his journal about Dutch's ideas, about the gang as a story of resistance to civilization. John never quite does. From Horseshoe Overlook to Clemens Point, there are small conversations where John undercuts the sermon. When Dutch declares that one last big score will save them all, John mutters in the background, heard that one before. When Dutch gives a rousing speech about being the last free men in a world where the old ways were dying, John answers with a dry, "Sure, Dutch, whatever you say." Some laugh. Javier chuckles. Bill snorts. The tension passes for a moment. Others bristle. Pearson goes quiet. Grimshaw's expression hardens. Micah's eyes narrow. In those throwaway lines, in that half-second of silence after the joke, the gang's loyalty map is drawn. Who still believes the father? And who hears the doubt and files it away as betrayal? Dutch hears it most of all. His response to Arthur's questions and John's questions could not be more different. When Arthur pushes back, Dutch slows down, explains, flatters. He calls Arthur son, reminds him of their dreams, wraps the lie in shared history. When John pushes back, Dutch goes cold. He brings up John running off, abandoning Abigail and Jack. He turns skepticism into sin, doubt into ingratitude. The same concern voiced by two men becomes, in Dutch's mind, loyalty from one and treachery from the other. It is not accidental. Dutch senses which son truly threatens his control. The camp itself quietly agrees. Arthur's tent is cluttered with drawings, books, little traces of a man trying to believe this world is home. Dutch's space is theatrical, rich fabrics and framed pictures, the stage from which he performs his philosophy. John's corner, by contrast, is almost aggressively plain. A bedroll, a chest, a few tools. Functional, temporary, from its humble beginnings at Coulter to the warmer air of Clemens Point. The environment says what John will not. He never trusts that this family, or this freedom, will last. On the surface, the gang in these early years looks united, a single outlaw family standing against civilization. But in the truest sense, the collapse has already begun. It lives in the boy who never fully believes the man calling himself father, in the quiet jokes during speeches, in the undecorated tent at the edge of camp. The question is not when the gang starts to fall apart. The question is how long Dutch can pretend he does not hear that doubt echoing in every plan he makes next. That echo of doubt grows louder with every new bedroll that appears around the fire. The gang stops being a handful of riders and starts becoming a moving city, a story of wandering outlaws turning their own legend into infrastructure. From its humble beginnings as three men and a dream, the Van der Linde gang begins to gather strays. Javier Escuela arrives first in many playthroughs, a passionate gunslinger and musician met in the chaos of the West. His tent is never just canvas and rope. A worn guitar leans in the corner, religious icons hang in quiet defiance, and a few carefully folded shirts hint at a man who wants order in a world built on violence. Listen long enough to his songs and campfire stories, and fragments of Mexico, of revolution and betrayal, drift through the smoke. Bill Williamson's corner of camp tells a different tale. Where Javier's space suggests discipline, Bill's is a low hill of bottles, half-cleaned guns, and discarded gear. He boasts about his time in the army, about battles and loyalty. But the mess around him betrays a man still trying to prove he belongs. In the truest sense, his tent is a battlefield between the soldier he claims to be and the frightened deserter he really is. Then there is Charles Smith, the quiet craftsman on the edge of camp. His bedroll is simple, but his tools are immaculate. Fletching laid out in precise rows, hunting gear repaired rather than replaced, small carvings tucked near his belongings. Ambient conversations reveal a childhood split between worlds, never fully accepted by either. His space becomes the living embodiment of survival without cruelty, of a man who kills to eat, not to dominate. Sadie Adler's transformation is carved straight into the dirt. At first, she sleeps in the main house at Horseshoe or Shady Bell, a widow in borrowed clothes, voice shaking with rage. Later, her own tent appears, bristling with ammunition, rifles propped where a mirror might stand. Her mini origin unfolds not in grand cutscenes, but in chores, in missions, in late night talks about freedom and vengeance, while the rest of the family pretends not to listen. Lenny Summers, too, is built in whispers. A young man reading by lantern light, law books and dime novels stacked beside his bed, quietly telling Arthur about a father lynched by a mob. No exposition dump, no speech from Dutch, just a voice in the dark, explaining why the old ways were dying, and why this makeshift family feels like the only justice left. These origins live in ambient dialogue, in Arthur's journal sketches of tents and faces, in throwaway lines when someone passes the stew pot. The camp becomes an archive, Javier humming a hymn, Bill muttering about discipline, Charles offering hunting lessons, Sadie sharpening a knife, Lenny debating politics. Each new member reinforces Dutch's philosophy that he is savior and shepherd, the man who finds every lost soul and gives it purpose. But every extra plate at Pearson's table is another mouth Dutch must feed, another loyalty he must juggle. The larger the family grows, the more fragile the dream becomes. And outside the ring of lanterns, the world was changing. Telegraph lines hum over the plains, railroads carve through hunting grounds, Pinkertons tighten their patrols. Even the map itself seems to push back, towns modernizing, posters warning of the gang, trains guarded by more rifles than before. The city Dutch builds on horseback is already under siege, not just from enemies with badges, but from a civilization that no longer has room for wandering empires. The next step in their journey will prove that the frontier is not just closing around them, it is preparing to crush them. If Coulter is the gang under siege, then Horseshoe Overlook is the gang pretending the siege will never reach them. The snow has melted, the river valley opens beneath the cliffs, and for a brief chapter, the Van der Linde camp becomes the living embodiment of Dutch's dream of freedom and family. From its humble beginnings on that rocky ledge, the layout of Horseshoe Overlook tells a story of gravity and orbit. Dutch's tent sits near the center, raised slightly, facing the valley as if addressing the whole world. Around him, the others arrange themselves in loose rings, Hosea close by. Arthur not far off, the women's wagons forming a domestic belt, the hired guns and drifters pushed toward the edges. It is a solar system in canvas and wood, with Dutch as the sun and everyone else caught in his pull. The details around that central tent reveal his philosophy in the truest sense. Dutch's space is cluttered but curated, books stacked in small towers, a worn copy of Philosophy of Liberty, maps spread over crates, sketches of routes and rail lines pinned down by bottles. This is not just a bedroll, it is a war room and a pulpit. Hosea's camp, by contrast, is modest and orderly, a simple bed, a small chest, a chair turned toward the fire. Where Dutch surrounds himself with grand ideas, Hosea surrounds himself with quiet practicality. Two old outlaws, two ways of seeing a world that was changing. Between them stretch the communal spaces that make Horseshoe Overlook feel almost hopeful. The long tables where Pearson slams down pots of stew, the crafting stations where ammunition and tonics are assembled, the wash lines and sewing corners where the women mend clothes while trading stories. It is a functioning village, humming with routine, not yet poisoned by open betrayal or paranoia. Morale lives in the small props. The food stores are full, barrels brimming with salted meat and coffee, crates of vegetables stacked neatly. Campfires burn high, not just for warmth but for gathering. At night, guitars and fiddles come out, Javier singing, Karen laughing too loud, Uncle pretending to work and failing at even that. Characters drift toward the flames to talk, sing, and play, and for a moment the gang is not a criminal enterprise under extinction. It is simply a family. Near Dutch's tent, the donation box and ledger turn that feeling into ritual. Every time a member drops in a few coins or a gold ring, the act affirms the idea that all this chaos serves a shared prosperity. The ledger's careful columns, who gave, who took, what was bought, tie Dutch's authority to the promise that he is not just taking. He is redistributing, protecting, providing. How long can that illusion hold? Because the contrast is already waiting. Compare these full tables, these bright fires, this ordered solar system to the darkness of Beaver Hollow, where the center cannot hold and the orbits break apart. The old ways were dying even here in this idyllic camp, and the next move the gang makes will show just how quickly a warm, living world can curdle into something colder. Clemens Point is the answer to that question, the high noon of the gang's fragile dream. After the cold of Coulter and the exposed hills of Horseshoe Overlook, the camp on the shore of Flatiron Lake feels, in the truest sense, like a rival. Warm lanterns glow through canvas at dusk, the water catches the last light of the sun, and for a brief stretch of months, the Van der Linde gang almost convinces itself that this is what freedom can look like. The layout tells the story before a single word of dialogue is spoken. Tents are spaced with confidence, rather than desperation, facing the lake as if the horizon itself has become a promise. Children run and play near the shallows, watched from a distance but not hovered over, because danger feels far away for once. Laundry lines sag under the weight of clean shirts and dresses, not rags, and small decorative touches appear in almost every corner: a flower in a jar, a patterned blanket, a book left open on a crate. This is a story of outlaws trying to live as though civilization has finally agreed to leave them alone. Prosperity reinforces the illusion. Successful heists and steady scores mean stew pots full of meat, coffee always brewing, and Strauss's ledger growing heavier by the day. Arthur's journal drawings from this period capture Dutch in heroic poses, the gang around bright campfires, the world still wide and inviting. Conversations drift through the camp about buying land, heading further west, raising families. From its humble beginnings in backroom robberies and train holdups, the gang has never felt more like a functioning community. The living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy made real, at least on the surface. Then the world shifts, and Shady Belle answers Clemens Point with a whisper of rot. The gang's next home is not an open camp by clear water, but a reclaimed plantation house choked by swamp air, its halls filled with dust, broken furniture, and bullet holes from the skirmish that cleared it. Bloodstains linger on warped floorboards. Portraits of long-gone owners hang crooked on the walls, their painted eyes watching this new, ragged family move in. The old ways were dying, but their ghosts have not left. Here, the environmental storytelling turns from hopeful to haunted. Gang members sleep in half-ruined rooms, cots jammed between collapsed beds and shattered mirrors. Loot is piled in mildewed parlors and decaying dining rooms, money and guns resting where enslaved labor and plantation wealth once defined the American South. Is it freedom, or is it just squatting in the carcass of a dead civilization? The irony is almost cruel. Dutch's idealistic crusade against power now shelters in the very architecture that power built. In Shady Belle, the gang's presence feels temporary, parasitic, already fading. Arthur's journal grows darker, Dutch's clothes and grooming more disheveled, Micah's influence more visible in whispered conversations down shadowed corridors. The progression from open, airy camps to this claustrophobic ruin, and eventually to the cave-like misery of Beaver Hollow, mirrors Dutch's own descent, from open-handed visionary to cornered animal. The spaces close in as his mind does, and the next move will close in even tighter, dragging the gang from this haunted house of American history into a city that has no room for ghosts at all. Saint Denis is the proof that the gang has crossed a line the world will not forgive. But long before the city swallows them, every major score has already been beating through the game like a pulse, each heist a heartbeat that the world around them hears and answers. From its humble beginnings with that first big train job in the snow, the pattern is there. Rob Cornwall's train outside Valentine, and the town does not simply reset when the mission ends. Bounty posters in the post office quietly update, the reward climbing from a few dollars to a small fortune. Lawmen start riding different routes, cutting across the heartlands where once there were only ranchers and drifters. In the truest sense, the gang's search for freedom is already tightening their cage. The Braithwaite and Gray schemes turn Rhodes into a theater of consequences. At the very beginning, it is a sleepy little place pretending to be civilized, a story of faded Southern glory and new American money. After the stagecoach robberies, the moonshine raids, and the disastrous plantation assault, the change is subtle but relentless. Townsfolk mutter in doorways about those outlaws out at Clemens Point. Saloons host nervous conversations about missing sons, burned fields, and Pinkertons on the way. Some praise the gang as a blow against corrupt families, others spit the word animals. Civilization has taken notice, and it is not impressed. Even the newspapers become characters in this story, the living embodiment of the world's judgment. Articles sensationalize the exploits of the Van der Linde outlaws, twisting motives, inventing details, turning Dutch's ragged family into a folk horror for city readers. The gang robs a train for survival. The paper calls it a terrorist attack on progress. Who controls the narrative now? The outlaws or the men who sell headlines? Back in camp, each score leaves scars that are harder to see but far more intimate. After a good haul, the music is louder, the food better, the laughter easier. Arthur's journal fills with sketches of poker games and quiet moments. After a failure or a bloody victory, the air changes. Men drink alone. Women fall silent. Some characters begin to withdraw from the nightly fire, their routines shrinking as their faith in Dutch's philosophy erodes. A family that once moved as one begins to fracture into smaller, private worlds. The economy itself bends around their actions. A shop in Valentine closes after a shootout, its windows boarded as if the town is trying to heal. St. Denis responds to the bank job with armed guards, jumpier police, and whispered warnings in alleyways. The old ways were dying, but the new order is not passive. It adapts, it fortifies, it learns. And that is the tragic irony at the heart of Dutch's dream. He believes he is waging war on a rigid, corrupt system, yet the system is faster, smarter, more flexible than his fading ideals. With every heist, every relocation, from Horseshoe Overlook to Clemens Point to Shady Belle and beyond, the map itself seems to close in. Patrols thickening, safe spaces disappearing, escape routes turning into dead ends. A story of loyalty and betrayal becomes a story of entrapment, of dreams and delusions colliding with railroads, telegraphs, and ledgers. The gang thinks it is striking blows for freedom. In reality, each blow only teaches civilization how to hit back harder. And the next score Dutch plans will not just change the world around them, it will shatter the illusion that he still understands that world at all. From the very beginning, the gang is not just running from pauses on horseback, it is running from a century that no longer has room for men like Dutch. The world was changing, and Rockstar hides that truth not in speeches, but in steel rails, humming wires, and the distant glow of electric light on the horizon. The railroads are the living embodiment of this new enemy. Early on, a train is a prize, a moving vault that promises quick money and a thrilling escape. The first robbery at Horseshoe Overlook feels daring and cinematic, a story of freedom and rebellion where the gang still believes in its own legend. But even in those moments, the tracks themselves tell another story. They crisscross the landscape, cut through forests and canyons, and always lead back to cities where bankers, politicians, and Pinkertons sit in comfort, counting the losses and planning their response. Telegraph poles march alongside those tracks, an army of wooden sentries carrying messages faster than any outlaw can ride. In towns, background NPCs mutter about new lines going up, about orders from St. Denis, about telegrams that bring news of robberies almost before the smoke is cleared. A sheriff once needed days to hear about Dutch's gang. Now, a clerk with a wire can have Pinkertons on a train within hours. The old ways were dying, and the gang barely realizes it until it is far too late. St. Denis itself is the clearest warning. From its humble beginnings as a trading port to the industrial sprawl seen in 1899, the city stands as civilization in the truest sense and as the gang's greatest nightmare. Newspapers on street corners trumpet corporate mergers, government bonds, and security contracts with agencies whose names appear again and again in small print. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, railroad companies, oil interests. Read closely and the future is right there. Outlaws arrested in other states, gangs broken by federal task forces, bounties paid not by ranchers but by corporations protecting their investments. Mission design mirrors this tightening noose. Early jobs are moonlit train heists and stagecoach ambushes, where lanterns swing and gunfire echoes across open fields. Later, the gang faces armored cars, searchlights, and coordinated law enforcement that moves with cold efficiency. What once felt romantic now feels suffocating. Each robbery in this new world is less a blow for freedom and more a desperate gasp against an enemy that never sleeps. The Pinkertons embody that faceless pressure. Before they ever storm a camp in a major cutscene, their presence is everywhere. Wanted posters with official seals, patrols on the roads near Blackwater, NPCs in saloons gossiping about government men and agency detectives cleaning up the frontier. They are not a rival gang to outshoot. They are an institution. How do outlaws fight an institution that can replace every fallen agent with 10 more? In the end, all these details converge into a single, brutal truth. The Von der Linde gang is not just fighting sheriffs, it is fighting history itself. And history is winning. The rails are already laid, the wires already strung, the ledger's already written. The only question left is how Dutch will react when the modern world finally looks him in the eye, and what he will sacrifice to pretend it still blinks first. History closes in on the gang from the outside, but the first real warning comes from within. It is not in a gunfight or a robbery gone wrong, but in something far quieter. The music begins to die. From its humble beginnings in the snowbound caves of Coulter to the sunlit fields of Horseshoe Overlook, the Van der Linde camp is, at the very beginning, the living embodiment of Dutch's promise, a wandering family that sings to keep the dark at bay. Early on, the fire is the center of that world. Javier strums his guitar, Karen belts out verses with drunken pride, and Pearson ladles stew while trading easy insults with Bill and Sean. Group sing-alongs roll through the night, and voices rise together on old folk songs and outlaw ballads. Characters call Arthur over, urge him to sit down, to share a drink, to add his voice. In those moments, the camp feels in the truest sense like a home, a story of freedom and fellowship holding back civilization's march for one more evening. Then the deaths begin to stack, and the soundscape changes. After Sean's ambush at Rhodes, the laughter around the fire comes a little slower. After the St. Denis bank job when Hosea and Lenny are cut down, it barely comes at all. Lenny's absence is not just a missing gun in a fight. It is the hole where his singing used to be, the silence where his jokes once bounced off the tents. The gang does not hold a grand funeral. The game simply stops letting certain songs happen. That is the hidden health bar of camp morale. Javier still plays, but less often. Karen drifts from rowdy choruses into bitter, isolated drinking. Some nights, no one gathers at the fire at all. Dutch's speeches, once met with cheers and raised bottles, start to draw only scattered murmurs, a few half-hearted shouts. Who wants to sing when the philosophy that bound this family together has turned into a string of broken promises and delusions? Individual arcs are written into that quiet. Sadie Adler, who once sat withdrawn at the edge of the light, grows fiercer and more purposeful, but she does not join the old sing-alongs. Her loyalty now points toward revenge and survival, not Dutch's dream. Others move the opposite way. At Beaver Hollow, men who once argued over songs now sit alone on crates, staring into the mud. The old ways were dying, and the campfire knew it first. Listen closer, and the ambient conversations complete the picture. In early chapters, talk drifts toward plans, teasing, shared memories of easier days. Later, whispers circle Dutch's decisions, muttered doubts about the Tahiti fantasy, and nervous mentions of Micah's growing influence. Some speak, barely above a breath, of a feeling that the dream is ending. It is a story of loyalty curdling into fear, of an outlaw family realizing that history will not blink. By the time Beaver Hollow echoes more with coughs and arguments than with music, the collapse is already written. Who still sings? Who sits in the shadows? Who no longer comes to the fire at all? These details map the gang's fate long before the final shootouts. The question is no longer whether the family will fall apart, but who will recognize that silent truth in time, and who will go down still pretending to hear the old songs. By the time the songs fade and the arguments take over, Dutch's voice becomes the loudest thing in camp. Not because his philosophy is stronger, but because it is all he has left. The story of his downfall is not a sudden collapse, but a steady widening gap between the words he repeats and the world that keeps refusing to bend. He clings to the slogans from the very beginning. We are family. We don't leave our own. One more score and we'll be free. They return again and again, almost verbatim, long after they have stopped matching reality. After Rhodes takes Sean, after St. Denis takes Hosea and Lenny, Dutch still stands before the fire and insists that the gang is the living embodiment of freedom and loyalty. Yet the camp around him has thinned, the faces have hardened, and those promises now echo against empty bedrolls. Rockstar threads the contradiction through quiet actions rather than grand speeches. Dutch abandons carefully laid plans the moment his pride is challenged, charging into St. Denis to chase Angelo Bronte's insult, dragging the gang to Guarma on a mad detour, then returning with nothing but more enemies. He leaves John to rot in Sisika for far too long, dismisses the rescue of Abigail as a distraction, and sacrifices allies like the Wapiti as expendable pieces on his private chessboard. In hushed conversations at Clemens Point and Beaver Hollow, the gang whispers what his speeches refuse to admit. Dutch is choosing his ego over their survival. Arthur's journal becomes the clearest barometer of this fracture. Early entries sketch Dutch as a towering figure, an idealistic outlaw philosopher, drawn with strong lines and almost romantic framing. The words around those drawings speak of belief, of destiny, of a man who might truly change a world where the old ways were dying. After St. Denis, the tone shifts. The handwriting grows more cramped, the commentary more bitter, the drawings of Dutch more angular and severe, eyes shaded, mouth tightened. Arthur begins to question every decision, to wonder when the dream turned into delusions, and whether he has been helping a lost soul or a madman. Rockstar reinforces this in the staging of Dutch's later speeches. At Horseshoe Overlook and Clemens Point, he addresses the camp in warm firelight, framed in wide shots that linger on listening faces, a leader surrounded by family. By Beaver Hollow, the light is harsher, colder, often pushed to the edges of the frame. The camera cuts faster, his pacing more frantic, and there are fewer close-ups of those who still believe. Who is even listening now? The audience, in the truest sense, is shrinking. In that contrast lies the real tragedy. The fall of the von der Linde gang is not only in the betrayals and gunfights that history remembers, but in these tiny, repeated moments when Dutch could choose principle and instead chooses pride. One broken promise at a time, from its humble beginnings to its violent end, the family he built becomes the instrument of its own destruction, and the next cracks will only cut deeper. Those cracks in Dutch's promises have a witness. From the very beginning, the quiet measure of how far the gang drifts from its ideals is Hosea Matthews, the fading conscience in a world that no longer wants to hear him. In the early camps, Hosea is the gang's anchor in the truest sense, the living embodiment of its older, more careful philosophy. Around the fire at Horseshoe Overlook or Clemens Point, he argues for smaller scores, safer jobs, clean exits. While Dutch dreams about grand statements against civilization, Hosea talks about buying a little place, about freedom earned through survival, not spectacle. Missions reflect that divide. Dutch pushes for big risks. Hosea suggests swindles, stagecoach robberies, cons that leave fewer bodies in the dust. At first, Dutch listens. Their partnership is a story of balance, of idealism tempered by pragmatism, of an outlaw family that still believes it can age out of the game. Hosea warns against roads, distrusts both the Greys and the Braithwaites, and urges caution before the St. Denis bank job. Each time, his voice is calm, reasoned, almost paternal. Each time, Dutch nods, agrees, promises to be careful. Then the world was changing, and Dutch changes with it. As Micah Bell slithers into the inner circle, the camera starts to tell a different story. In cutscenes at Shady Bell and later Beaver Hollow, Dutch turns his head toward Micah, not Hosea, when plans are made. Micah advocates violence, chaos, big scores that will show them all, and Dutch smiles. Hosea raises doubts, and Dutch waves them away. How many times does Hosea quietly say, "This is not the way," only for the plan to go ahead unchanged? The shift is not only in dialogue, it is carved into the camp itself. Hosea's tent, once close to Dutch's, feels a step further removed with each move, tucked slightly to the side, surrounded by books and sketches of a life that might have been. Other gang members stop drifting by to ask his opinion. Group conversations form around Dutch, Micah, and the younger guns, while Hosea lingers at the edge of the frame, a man present but no longer central. In private, especially with Arthur, his tone transforms. Early on, he gently corrects Dutch's excesses, still believing in the dream from its humble beginnings. Later, he confides doubts in low, weary conversations by the fire, admitting that Dutch is slipping, that the old ways were dying, that the man he followed is being replaced by something harsher. Is this still a family, or just a story Dutch tells to keep everyone in line? By the time the St. Denis Bank is on the table, Hosea is already a ghost in his own gang. His final warnings go unheeded, his last counsels drowned out by Micah's poison. When Hosea is removed from the story, the gang's internal break vanishes, but Rockstar has been preparing that loss for hours, one ignored warning at a time. And once that conscience is gone, the question becomes chillingly simple. Who, if anyone, is left to stop Dutch now? Without Hosea, Dutch does not fall in silence. He falls with someone whispering in his ear. From its humble beginnings in the snow at Coulter, that whisper has a name: Micah Bell. At the very beginning, Micah appears to be just another loud, abrasive outlaw in a camp already full of big personalities. He drinks too much, boasts too often, and treats violence as entertainment rather than necessity. Yet, from the first rescue at Strawberry, his strategy is clear. Where Hosea questions Dutch, Micah flatters him. Where Arthur challenges the plan, Micah praises the philosophy. He tells Dutch he is a genius, that the world is against him, that only he truly understands. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, distilled into a single toxic relationship. Rockstar makes that infection visible in the camp itself. In Coulter and Horseshoe Overlook, Micah is pushed to the fringes, his bedroll and gear tucked away, his presence tolerated more than welcomed. By Clements Point and Shady Bell, his sleeping area creeps closer to Dutch's space, and by Beaver Hollow he is almost grafted onto the center of power, his tent practically sharing the same shadow as Dutch's. The living embodiment of Dutch's new direction is no longer Hosea's books and maps, but Micah's guns, liquor bottles, and grisly trophies scattered around his camp. Every prop screams ego, aggression, and a hunger for chaos. Others notice. Background conversations reveal Bill uneasy about Micah's temper, Charles quietly warning that something is wrong with this man, Tilly and Karen trading nervous comments about his stare. Even Javier, once a romantic idealist, sounds wary. Yet each time conflict flares, Dutch steps in on Micah's side. He waves away concerns, reframes Micah's cruelty as necessary toughness, and chastises Arthur for negativity rather than Micah for recklessness. When two outlaws nearly come to blows over Micah's behavior, the irony is cutting. In a camp built on freedom and family, the most divisive voice is the one being protected. On missions, Micah's influence is measured in blood. A robbery that could end with masked threats and a clean getaway becomes a massacre once he starts firing early, taunting lawmen, or urging Dutch to finish it. In Strawberry, in the bank at Valentine, in the escalating brutality after St. Denis, his presence pushes every situation away from calculated risk and toward open war with civilization. Each outburst worsens the gang's standing with the law, drives up bounties, and turns Dutch's rhetoric about principle into a trail of bodies. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Micah offers Dutch an answer. Not adaptation, but escalation. Through shifting tents, poisoned conversations, and increasingly reckless missions, Rockstar frames Micah as more than a traitor. He is an ideological infection that finds the cracks already forming in Dutch's dream and widens them. The question is no longer whether the gang can survive the Pinkertons, but whether it can survive the man now standing at Dutch's shoulder, and what happens when that whisper finally drowns out every other voice. Micah may be the whisper in Dutch's ear, but the real record of that corruption sits in Arthur Morgan's hands, a worn journal turning darker with every page. It begins as a story of pride and belonging, a running testament to an idealistic philosophy and the man who embodied it. By the middle chapters, those same pages read more like a slow confession, written by a believer who no longer trusts his own prayers. From the very beginning, Arthur draws Dutch as larger than life. Broad-shouldered sketches where the leader fills the frame, hat cocked, eyes bright, the living embodiment of the gang's dreams of freedom. After Rhodes and the bloodbath at the Braithwaite Manor, the drawings change. Dutch starts shrinking on the page. He stands further back, half-turned, often swallowed by shadow or smoke. In one mid-game entry, Arthur writes that Dutch ain't the man he was, a simple line that lands harder than any gunshot. The art and the words are pulling in the same direction, distance. Each time Dutch crosses another line, the ink grows colder. The decision to abandon the hostages in Rhodes, the needless killing in St. Denis, the broken promise to help John's family escape, all leave their mark. Arthur's comments shift from Dutch has a plan to Dutch says he has a plan, to the brutally honest, I don't know what Dutch is thinking anymore. What began as loyal commentary becomes a running ledger of betrayal, a quiet audit of a failing philosophy as the world was changing and the old ways were dying. This inner fracture is not confined to the journal. It leaks into Arthur's voice. Mid-game conversations at camp and on horseback begin to allow more pushback. Arthur can question Dutch about Cornwall, about Tahiti, about the wisdom of trusting Micah. NPCs notice. Hosea sounds tired but grateful when Arthur dares to challenge Dutch. John reacts with wary surprise, hearing the loyal enforcer finally say what he has been thinking. Even Dutch bristles, his charming cadence hardening when Arthur's questions cut too close. In the truest sense, the gang hears the faith leaving his tone before they see it in his actions. The language of the journal mirrors that emotional withdrawal. Early on, Arthur writes, "We did this, our camp, our family." As the failures mount, those pronouns drift. The camp becomes them, this lot, these fools chasing dreams. It is a small shift, almost invisible in the margins, Yet it marks the moment when Arthur stops standing inside Dutch's circle and starts observing it from the outside. How many tragedies in this world begin with a single word changing from us to them? Taken together, those sketches, phrases, and tonal shifts reveal a hidden structure. The missions tell the story of an outlaw gang collapsing under pressure from civilization and Pinkertons. The journal tells the secret main story of Red Dead Redemption 2, one man's slow, painful loss of faith in the father who raised him, and the question of what that lost soul will do once he finally accepts that the man he followed is never leading them home. Arthur's doubts are written in ink. John's are carved in the way he lives. From the very beginning, John Marston has never fully surrendered to Dutch's philosophy, and as the gang unravels, that old skepticism hardens into something colder, clearer, and far more dangerous to Dutch's dream. John had always been the prodigal son, the one who disappeared for a year, the one Dutch berated for abandoning the family. Yet that absence is a story of a man already testing the limits of Dutch's promised freedom. By the time the gang reaches Shady Belle and then Beaver Hollow, John's priorities have shifted completely. Abigail's exhaustion, Jack's fear, the way the world was changing around them, these become more real to him than speeches about civilization and progress. The gang is no longer a home, it is a trap. Late in the game, the mask finally slips in open daylight. John starts saying out loud what Arthur has only dared to scribble in the journal. On the ride back from Guarma, when Dutch clings to the fantasy that one more score will fix everything, John challenges him. This was supposed to be the last time. How many times has that been said? Later, at Beaver Hollow, when Dutch talks about Tahiti or Australia, John pointedly asks where Hosea's plans ever led them except to graves and Pinkertons. It is the living embodiment of Arthur's private disillusionment, spoken through a man who has run out of patience. The reactions around the camp are a quiet referendum on loyalty. Bill and Javier bristle, calling John a coward, a man who never really believed. Micah mocks him, framing John's concern for Abigail and Jack as selfishness, a betrayal of the greater cause, yet others hesitate. Charles watches in silence, understanding the cost. Sadie backs John's instincts, sensing that staying with Dutch is a death sentence. Even Arthur, standing between them, feels the ground shifting. The family Dutch built from its humble beginnings is now arguing over what family even means. Mission design starts forcing these tensions into the open. In Horseman Apocalypses and The Fine Art of Conversation, Arthur and John ride together more often, placed on the flank while Dutch and Micah charge ahead. Their conversations weigh Dutch's orders against the lives of innocents, against Abigail's pleas, against Jack's future. Do they storm into St. Denis again, or pull back? Do they chase Angelo Bronte's ghost, or cut their losses and disappear? Each choice presses them between loyalty and conscience, between dreams and delusions. Watching Arthur change becomes the final catalyst. John sees the man who once defended Dutch without question now risk everything to save a single family, to pull John out of Sisika, to get Abigail free. In the truest sense, Arthur's late-game resolve becomes John's "I told you so," not gloating, but a grim confirmation that his doubts were right all along. Those rides together, those muttered arguments in the rain and mud, explain why John will finally walk away and why he will carry the gang's legacy into a new story of outlaws and civilization. The only question is how much he will have to lose before he does. John's doubts may be vindicated, but the gang does not shatter in a single gunshot or a single argument. It erodes, one broken promise at a time, until the dream of freedom Dutch preached from the very beginning is buried under its own weight. Rockstar hides those fractures in dirt, in discarded objects, in the way people stop looking one another in the eye. The Blackwater ferry job is the first great betrayal, and it happens off-screen. Dutch insists it was a noble stand against a corrupt civilization, a necessary strike that went wrong. Yet campfire whispers and stray remarks reveal another story. Hosea's hesitation, Arthur's unease, John's absence. In the newspapers, the gang is not a band of tragic rebels, but butchers who slaughtered innocents on a pleasure boat. From its humble beginnings as a story of stealing from the rich and powerful, the gang is already being written into history as something far uglier. That same pattern repeats in St. Denis. Dutch calls the bank heist a glorious last score. The posters and headlines call it a massacre. Hosea and Lenny are reduced to body counts in print, while Dutch turns their deaths into fuel for his own philosophy. Walk through the city afterward and strangers mutter about the lunatics who tried to rob a bank in the middle of civilization. Dutch hears destiny. The world hears desperation. The treatment of John is another betrayal, quieter but just as corrosive. Dutch once called John a son in the truest sense, Now he calls him a coward for wanting to protect his family. Arthur's journal catches the shift in brutal detail. Early pages sketch Dutch as the living embodiment of rebellion, all sharp lines and admiration. Later entries describe Dutch talking crazy, Dutch leaving John to die, and finally name his actions as selfishness and cowardice. Arthur stops making excuses. His pen becomes a verdict. The camp itself becomes a map of betrayal. After Blackwater, Hosea's plans and ledgers still sit neatly arranged. After Rhodes and St. Denis, his tent at Shady Bell is a quiet shrine, untouched, a constant reminder that Dutch's decisions killed the man who always pulled him back from the edge. When Molly is cast out and Trelawney drifts away, their spaces are stripped bare, bedrolls gone, only small personal items forgotten in the rush. Who sits where at the fire changes too. Micah inches closer to Dutch, Javier and Bill close ranks, while Arthur, Charles, and Sadie peel away into the shadows. Listen long enough, and the world itself testifies. Camp routines grow harsher, laughter rarer, chores more mechanical as the old ways were dying. NPCs remark that the gang is finished, that the age of outlaws is over. Each abandoned tent, each bitter line from Arthur, each hostile headline is another cut. The gang does not fall because of one traitor or one bad job. It falls because 100 small betrayals pile up, quietly recorded in the world for anyone willing to see them. All of those quiet betrayals, all of those dying campfires, lead to one final image, the gang retreating into a hole in the ground. Beaver Hollow is not just another hideout, it is the punchline to the entire dream, the place where an idealistic philosophy that once promised freedom and family ends up cowering in the dark. From its humble beginnings at Horseshoe Overlook, the camp was open, sunlit, spread across a ridge that overlooked the world Dutch swore he would change. Beaver Hollow is the exact opposite. The gang squeezes into a damp cave, its walls slick with moisture, its ceiling low and oppressive, its entrances narrow and easily missed. This is not a home being built in defiance of civilization. This is a burrow, a last refuge for hunted animals who know the old ways were dying and have nowhere else to run. The layout tells the story in the truest sense. Earlier camps arranged everyone in a wide circle, with a fire at the center and Dutch's tent proudly placed to oversee it all. Here, Dutch has pushed himself deeper into the cave, away from what remains of his family. The path to him winds past crates, shadows, and nervous guards, as if approaching a minor king who no longer trusts his own court. His physical isolation mirrors the emotional distance that has been widening since St. Denis. Dutch is still the living embodiment of the gang's philosophy, but now that philosophy is muttered in echoing tunnels, not proclaimed beneath open skies. Around him, the communal spaces have withered. The big shared tables are cramped into corners, the campfire feels incidental rather than central, and conversations fracture into small, wary clusters. Bill drinks by himself. Javier broods near the entrance. Micah lurks close to Dutch's corner of the cave, a whispered influence rather than a visible brother-in-arms. Where once the camp felt like a single organism breathing together, Beaver Hollow feels like a collection of organs kept in the same body only by habit and fear. Is this still a family, or just outlaws sharing the same hiding place until the next disaster? The props drive the point home. Gone are the little decorations, the flowers, the books laid out with care, the sense that people are trying to carve a life out of the wilderness. In their place, weapons stacked in corners, ammunition boxes half open, food and medical supplies piled haphazardly on crates and bedrolls. The camp is cluttered, neglected, its mess a reflection of Dutch's unraveling mind. His once immaculate appearance has grown darker and more disheveled, and the environment follows suit, as if the cave itself is catching his delusions. Beaver Hollow is, in a story of loyalty and betrayal, the environmental answer to Horseshoe Overlook's hope. The dream that began under blue skies has retreated underground, hiding from the world it once promised to liberate. What began at the very beginning as an open campfire circle has become a tomb with a door. The only question left is who walks out of that cave, and who stays buried in it. Beaver Hollow buries the gang in darkness, and Dutch most of all. The cave is a tomb, but the first corpse laid out on the slab is his reflection. From its humble beginnings, this was a story of a man who dressed his philosophy on his own skin, and in Red Dead Redemption 2, that costume quietly rots in front of everyone. At the very beginning, Dutch van der Linde cuts a striking figure. The black waistcoat with the red trim, the crisp white shirt, the polished shoes and gold pocket watch, the carefully waxed mustache and oiled hair. He is the living embodiment of control. His speeches about freedom, family, and civilization come from a man who looks untouchable, almost theatrical, a self-made legend who steps out of the snow at Coulter as if the storm itself answers to him. His color, his shine, his posture all say the same thing. The world was changing, but he would bend it to his will. Then the plans start to fail. Horseshoe Overlook still carries a hint of that early swagger, yet Dutch's colors already darken, the bright accents buried under blacks and deep reds. After Sean dies in Rhodes and Jack is taken, his shirts lose their flourish, his vests grow plainer, his hat brim dips lower over eyes that no longer quite meet the gang's. When Hosea and Lenny fall in St. Denis, the transformation accelerates. Dutch's once immaculate mustache loosens, his hair curls out from under the hat, and his outfits lean into somber blacks and muddy browns, as if the city's soot has stained him permanently. Each blow chips away another piece of the persona. Cornwall's death, the botched escape from Guarma, the Pinkertons' tightening noose. With every failure, Dutch's clothes fit him less like a uniform and more like a costume he has slept in for too many nights. By the time the gang reaches Shady Bell, and then Beaver Hollow, there is a haunted edge to his eyes and a slackness to his grooming that no speech can conceal. The man preaching order cannot keep his own collar straight. The contrast with Arthur and John makes this unraveling even sharper. Arthur, a lost soul who begins as the rough enforcer, slowly grows cleaner, more deliberate in his dress as his moral clarity hardens. John, once the scruffy protege, starts to resemble a man preparing for a different life. Dutch moves in the opposite direction. The father figure who once towered above them in poise and color ends up looking more ragged than the sons who have outgrown him, his hair wild, his mustache unwaxed, his coat hanging loose on a body driven by paranoia. Rockstar, in the truest sense, uses Dutch's body as a canvas for his psychological collapse. The game never announces this descent. It simply lets the mirror tell the truth. A philosophy built on control is betrayed by a face that can no longer be controlled, a costume that no longer fits the role. And as the cave walls close in, one question lingers in that dim reflection. When Dutch finally steps back into the light, what will be left of the man who once dressed himself as a god? When Dutch finally steps back into the light at Beaver Hollow, it is not just his face that has changed. The entire camp has shifted around him. A new center of gravity has formed, quiet at first, then unmistakable. Micah Bell, the living embodiment of the gang's worst impulses, building his own kingdom in the shadows of Dutch's collapsing throne. From the very beginning of the Beaver Hollow chapter, the staging tells the story. In group meetings, Dutch stands near the cave mouth or the fire, and Micah is almost always at his shoulder, leaning in, whispering in his ear, answering questions before longer tenured members can speak. Men who bled for Dutch at Horseshoe Overlook and Clemens Point now stand pushed to the edges of the frame, faces half lit, bodies half turned away from the decisions that will seal their fate. The old ways were dying, and the camera knew it. It is a strange reversal. Once, Arthur and Hosea flanked Dutch, creating a triangle of counsel and restraint. Now, that triangle has been shattered. Micah steps into the empty space, not as a partner, but as a parasite. When Dutch doubts a plan, Micah is there to reassure him. When Dutch explodes in anger, Micah is there to feed it. And when Dutch pauses, uncertain, who is already at his ear, promising that the dream is still alive if they just push harder, hit bigger, trust fewer? Around him, a smaller, meaner constellation forms. Cleet and Joe do not orbit Dutch so much as they orbit Micah, watching his reactions, laughing at his cruelty, waiting for his nod before they move. In the caves, they linger near his fires, not the communal one. On jobs, their eyes go to him first, even when Dutch is speaking. It is a micro-gang growing inside a dying gang, a story of loyalty and betrayal playing out in the background while the main plot chases one last score. The environment reinforces the split. Arthur's tent once held medical supplies, letters, small tokens of a found family. Micah's corner of Beaver Hollow, by contrast, is loaded with weapons, ammunition, and stolen trinkets piled with no concern for anyone else. Knives on crates, rifles against rocks, loot tucked away where only he and his new followers can reach it. This is not a communal cache, it is an arsenal. In the truest sense, Micah is preparing for a future beyond the Vanderlinde name, even as he claims to defend it. Listen closely in those cramped tunnels and around those low fires, and the quiet sabotage becomes clear. Micah questions Arthur's health, John's commitment, their supposed softness in a hardening world. He hints that Arthur is turning against Dutch, that John is thinking of civilization, of Abigail and Jack, more than freedom. Each whispered doubt widens the fracture. Each sly comment paints Micah as Dutch's only true defender, the last man willing to do what must be done. By the time the final betrayals arrive, the split is no sudden twist. The gang is already two gangs sharing one dying name, one clinging to an idealistic past, the other embracing pure survival. The cave walls have been telling that truth for hours. The question now is simple and devastating. When the shooting starts, which camp will Dutch believe he belongs to? When the shooting finally starts, Arthur's war is no longer with the law or with rival gangs. It is with Dutch. Every late-game choice becomes a verdict on the man who raised him, and on the philosophy that once promised freedom and family in the truest sense. The turning point is framed not as a grand speech, but as a fork in the road. In Red Dead Redemption, Arthur can follow Dutch's order and help chase the money, or he can turn back for John. The camera does something quiet and devastating here. It lingers on Arthur's face, the weight of years pressed into a single, pained hesitation, before cutting to John's desperate climb and Abigail's tear-streaked plea echoing in memory. One path serves Dutch's dream. The other serves the people that dream has been crushing. Rockstar builds these moments as a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions. Help John escape the gunfire on the rooftop, and later, townsfolk and gang survivors speak of Arthur with a different tone. Charles and Sadie will reference what he did for John, as if trying to keep his name clean in a world that is already rewriting the gang as nothing but butchers. Ignore John, cling to Dutch, and the praise grows colder, more uncertain, with some characters quietly questioning what Arthur really stood for when it counted. NPCs become a kind of jury. Camp conversations at Beaver Hollow shift after those choices. Even in that rotting cave, the living embodiment of the gang's decay, small remarks cut deep. Javier and Bill echo Dutch's accusations of betrayal if Arthur defies him, while Tilly and Mary Beth sense that he is trying to save something worth keeping from its humble beginnings. The same mission, the same gunfights, but the story the world tells about Arthur Morgan changes. His journal is the final courtroom. Early entries sketch Dutch as a hero, a teacher, a man ahead of civilization. By the end, the handwriting grows harsher, the drawings more haunted. Arthur writes openly that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, and that Dutch's philosophy had curdled into something cruel. He wonders if John can be better, if Jack can somehow stay untouched by all this blood. Sometimes he addresses them almost directly, as if the pages are a will no lawyer will ever see. The environment itself passes sentence on his last stand. Ride out as a bitter enforcer, low honor dragging the sky into a bruised, choking dusk, and Arthur dies under storm clouds, the land around him muddy and lifeless, Micah's laughter echoing as Dutch walks away. Choose to save John, to turn against Micah, and the game paints a different ending. A red gold sunrise, a quiet ridge, the wind moving through the grass as Arthur watches the horizon. The same mountain, two different graves. In both versions, the camp is already a graveyard of ideals. Tents are torn, supplies ruined, Hosea's old books abandoned in the dirt. Yet Arthur's last acts are no longer about preserving Dutch's name. They are about ensuring that someone walks away from the ruins. The emotional handoff is deliberate. As Arthur collapses, John rides toward a future he does not yet understand. The next chapter will follow him, but every step he takes is paid for by a man who finally chose what, and who, was worth saving. Arthur dies on the mountain, but John's story has been quietly unfolding for hours before that last ride. While Dutch rants about scores and Micah whispers about revenge, John keeps talking about something far less glamorous: land, fences, and a future that does not end in a gunfight. From the very beginning of camp life, the clues are there. Around the fire at Horseshoe Overlook, John mentions wanting a place where Jack can grow up without running from the law, a small spread with some cattle and a clean bed. Javier scoffs, Bill calls it cowardly, and even Arthur teases him for dreaming of chores instead of shootouts. To men who worship freedom as robbery and flight, the idea of settling becomes almost an insult. Yet John repeats it, in side missions and idle chatter, returning to that same fragile dream of stability, as if he cannot quite let it go. Those words are paired with the way he looks at the world. When the gang rides past quiet ranches in New Hanover or little homesteads tucked into the trees near Clemens Point, others talk about how easy they would be to rob. John often falls silent. He lingers on porches during debt collections, runs a hand along a fence post, makes a low remark about how peaceful it seems. Where Bill sees marks and Dutch sees a rigged civilization, John sees the outline of a life he has never had. It is a story of a man already glancing sideways at another path while still pretending to be the loyal outlaw. Rockstar reinforces this with spaces that mirror his future. The ranch outside Strawberry, the small farms in the Heartlands, the valley near Pronghorn Ranch in the epilogue. John reacts to these places differently, almost reverently. Is it coincidence that the quiet, windswept basins he stares at feel so close to Beecher's hope? Or that missions where he helps honest ranchers echo the work he will later do for his own family? The world was changing, and John, in the truest sense, was learning to want that change. After the gang collapses and the epilogue begins, the environmental storytelling becomes the living embodiment of his transformation. Gone are the poker tables and whiskey crates. In their place, tools leaning against half-built walls, rough-hewn posts marking out future corrals, piles of lumber, modest furniture dragged into a bare house. Every hammer strike is a rejection of Dutch's philosophy. Every fence panel is a small betrayal of that old dream of endless freedom. Beecher's hope in Red Dead Redemption 1 completes this visual language. The ranch is simple, worn, and clearly hard-won, but its layout, its fences, even its cramped interiors echo the early epilogue builds. From its humble beginnings as a few boards in the mud to the finished homestead years later, the continuity turns John's arc into more than dialogue. It becomes architecture, a physical record of redemption attempted if not fully achieved. The old ways were dying, and John was trying to bury them under posts and planks. Yet even as he builds, questions remain. Can a man who spent his life tearing the world apart really hold a family together, or is Beecher's hope already haunted by the gunshots that are coming next? John trying to hammer a future into the ground does not stop the past from talking. While he builds fences, the world beyond Beecher's hope is quietly rewriting the Van der Linde gang into legend, rumor, and warning. A story of loyalty and betrayal becomes, in the public record, something far simpler. Criminals hunted and finally tamed by civilization. By the late game, that rewriting is plastered on walls. Bounty posters for former gang members grow more frequent and more precise. Each new sheet a revision of who they were. Early on, Arthur is just another wanted outlaw with a reward and a name. Later, the ink digs deeper. Height, scars, cold blue eyes. Alleged massacres that never quite happen the way they're described. The gang's robberies become terror campaigns. Their escapes cowardly ambushes. Their philosophy reduced to a single word in bold print. Dangerous. Those exaggerations are not accidents. They are how a nervous nation makes sense of men it cannot control. From its humble beginnings as a band of idealistic thieves, the gang is transformed into the living embodiment of lawless chaos on every notice board from Valentine to Ansburg. Even dead members linger as faces on yellowed paper, their bounties technically void, their reputation still paying dividends to a system that needs monsters. The newspapers go further. Late-game issues dissect the St. Denis bank disaster with clinical glee, recounting Hosea's public execution and Lenny's death as if they were scenes in a lurid dime novel. Columns rail against bandit armies and anarchist agitators, folding Dutch's rhetoric into a broader panic about the closing frontier. Editorials praise the Pinkertons and the government response, insisting that the old ways were dying and that men such as Dutch were simply the last diseased outgrowths of a vanishing era. The nuance of their dreams never makes it to print. On the ground, the reaction is even more tangible. Law patrols thicken along the routes the gang once rode with easy confidence. Roads near roads, the swamps around Shady Bell, the forest by Beaver Hollow, all become dangerous gauntlets of riders who draw faster, shout harsher, and shoot sooner. Places that once felt familiar turn hostile, as if the land itself has turned its back on them. In the truest sense, the gang has become a roaming state of emergency. Listen closely in saloons and on train platforms, and the final insult appears. Ambient conversations turn the gang's story into gossip and cautionary tale. A drunk retells the St. Denis shootout as a comedy of errors. A shopkeeper warns a boy not to end up another Dutch van der Linde. Strangers debate whether Arthur Morgan ever really existed at all. Deeply personal tragedies are flattened into sensational anecdotes for people who never heard Hosea laugh or saw John hold his son. Here lies the cruel contrast. To themselves, they were freedom seekers, a family pushing back against a rigged world. To history, to the encroaching machinery of civilization, they are just one more gang whose end was inevitable. And if the world misremembers them, what chance does any lost soul have of telling a different story next? History misremembers them as a single bloody moment. The game quietly shows a family dying by inches long before the final gunshots. By Beaver Hollow, the Van der Linde gang is already a ghost, the living embodiment of a dream that kept walking after its heart stopped. The atmosphere in those last nights is unmistakable. The great communal fire that once drew everyone in now burns lower, ringed by empty crates and empty chairs. Conversations are shorter, more brittle, often broken by long silences where only the wind and the dripping cave can be heard. Faces are gaunter, shoulders slump in idle animations, and gang members who once lounged with easy confidence now pace, fidget, and glance toward the trees, as if expecting the world or civilization itself to come crashing in at any second. The fractures are visible in who stands where, and who refuses to stand together at all. Arthur and John rarely share relaxed moments. When they do speak, it is about escape, not adventure. Javier, once John's partner in mischief, keeps his distance, watching him with a wary, almost wounded expression. Tilly and Mary Beth start packing early, folding clothes, tucking away keepsakes, their tents half empty long before anyone officially leaves. Even the canvas tells the story. Hosea's old spot feels like a shrine, half abandoned, half preserved, a reminder that the very beginning of this family is gone and not coming back. Around the dim fire, the gang's philosophy finally unravels out loud. Bill, who once parroted Dutch's speeches, mutters that the old man has lost his mind. Karen drinks harder and whispers that they should have walked away in St. Denis. Pearson, normally blustering, lets slip that there is no future here, only a slower or faster death. These conversations are often cut short in an instant. The moment Dutch or Micah steps into the circle, the air snaps tight, voices flatten, and the lies about Tahiti or one last score are repeated with mechanical loyalty. Fear has replaced faith. Even the smallest details announce the end. Pearson's tables, once crowded with meat and bread, grow bare. Fewer carcasses hang from the lines. Hunting runs happen less often as morale collapses. Stew loses variety, then quantity, until it becomes a thin, miserable broth. Empty bottles pile up. The camp ledger that once charted prosperity now reads like a list of debts and delusions, a story of scarcity closing in on every side as the old ways were dying. By the time the last stand begins, the collapse is already complete. The bullets only confirm what the tents, the food, and the silences have been saying for hours of in-game time. This family is gone. The final shootouts are not the death of the Van der Linde gang in the truest sense, but the body finally following where the spirit, the loyalty, and the dreams of freedom went long before. And in the ashes of Beaver Hollow, another story begins to stir, one that will carry Dutch's shadow into a new decade and a new tragedy. The ashes at Beaver Hollow are still warm when the final act begins. The gang is broken in the truest sense, yet the world refuses to let it die quietly. The Pinkertons close in, Micah whispers poison, and Dutch clings to a philosophy that has slipped through his fingers. Those last assaults are not random shootouts. They are the bill coming due. From the very beginning, every newspaper headline about modernization, every bounty poster nailed to a town wall, has been warning that civilization is learning their names. The first Pinkerton raid at Horseshoe Overlook feels shocking, but the agents have been mentioned in backroom conversations, in Arthur's journal, even in idle camp chatter. By the time they stormed Shady Bell and later Beaver Hollow, it is clear. The world was changing, and the old ways were dying. The final confrontations are written in blood, but they were foreshadowed in whispers. Hosea, the gang's conscience, spends campfire nights talking about leaving, about retiring to a little cottage, about freedom without guns. He is the one who doubts Dutch's Grand St. Denis bank plan, the one whose tent is filled with books, travel guides, and maps of a quieter life. So when Hosea is dragged onto those steps and executed in front of the crowd, it is not just a loss. It is the public murder of a different future, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, collapses in a single bullet. Lenny's fate is seeded the same way. Around camp, he jokes about being young, about having time, about seeing the world beyond the gang's shadow. His journal entry about his father's lynching and his talk of education make him the living embodiment of a new generation that might outrun this outlaw life. Then, on the St. Denis rooftops, he rises to shout in triumph and is cut down instantly. How many times did the game show him looking up at the horizon, only for his death to come from above? All of it leads to the mountain. That final climb with Arthur and Micah through wind and snow visually echoes earlier rides, the whole gang moving as one across the heartlands, Dutch and Hosea flanking Arthur as a proud son. Now the composition is the same, but thinner, colder, poisoned. Where there was once a line of riders, there are only three silhouettes, dragging the weight of every betrayal behind them. On the ridge, the staging is cruelly familiar. Dutch, Arthur, and Micah stand in a rough triangle, weapons drawn, framed against the sky exactly where the gang once posed shoulder to shoulder after big scores. The camera lingers on Dutch in the middle, torn between the man who represents his past loyalty and the man who feeds his present delusions. His eyes never quite meet Arthur's. His shoulders sag under an invisible burden. When he fires, it is not to save a friend, but to remove a problem. Dutch's final choices are as ambiguous as his speeches have always been. He refuses to fully side with Arthur or Micah, drifting between them, repeating fragments of his old rhetoric about faith and betrayal. His body language tells the real story. The slow turn away from Arthur's outstretched hand, the hollow stare at Micah's corpse, the silent walk into the fog. Is this a leader escaping responsibility, or a lost soul who finally understands what he has done? Those bullets on the mountain are not surprises. They are the inevitable echoes of camp layouts, journal sketches, and quiet doubts. From its humble beginnings as a family around a fire to this frozen standoff in the clouds, the gang has been marching toward this cliff. Yet even as Dutch disappears into the mist, the tale is not done. Somewhere out there, another Von der Linde survivor is already deciding what comes next, and who has to die for it. Dutch disappears into the fog, the last shout fading into the wind, and the grand philosophy of the Von der Linde gang seems to vanish with him. But Rockstar does something quietly ruthless here. The speeches end, the gunfire stops, and the final word on this outlaw family is not delivered in a cutscene at all. It is written in stone. Literally. After the story concludes, the world does not simply reset. Across the hills and forests, on cliffs and in clearings once ridden past at full gallop, small graves appear for the fallen members of the gang. No marker announces this, no mission demands a visit. Yet each grave carries a name, an epitaph, and a carefully chosen patch of earth that together become a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family buried where it fell. Hosea Matthews, the man who always wanted a cottage and a quiet life, lies on a gentle rise overlooking a calm stretch of water. His grave is ringed with trees and soft grass, a peaceful corner of a world that never gave him peace while he lived. The inscription is simple, almost plain, because Hosea never needed grand slogans. In the truest sense, this is the retirement he earned and never reached. Not a bustling town, not a new civilization, just stillness. Lenny Summers rests high above the land, on a rocky overlook where the horizon stretches farther than the eye can comfortably follow. It is a cruel irony and a perfect choice. The youngest dreamer of the gang, a man who barely had time to see the world beyond St. Denis, is given a view that seems to go on forever. Flowers cling to the stone, wind scours the ridge, and the grave feels exposed yet proud, the living embodiment of a future stolen mid-sentence. Other markers cut deeper through understatement. Sean's grave is almost rough, the carving blunt, echoing the loud, reckless energy that got him killed. Kieran's is small and lonely, off the beaten path, as if the gang's most uncertain recruit remains a lost soul even in death. Some epitaphs are heartfelt, some border on ironic, but together they map the distance from its humble beginnings as an idealistic band of misfits to a scattered trail of headstones. The surroundings do as much talking as the words. Weathered stones lean under old pines. Wildflowers reclaim mounds of earth. Snow gathers around certain graves, as if the cold that closed in at Coulter never really left them. Each site feels tailored to a personality or a fate. Calm shade for the tired strategist, open sky for the hopeful youth, hard ground for those crushed by the world that was changing while the old ways were dying. Then comes the quietest, sharpest layer of all. Visiting these places in the epilogue draws out rare lines from John Marston, a man trying to build a ranch while dragging a cemetery behind him. He speaks softly at Hosea's grave, guilt and gratitude tangled together, remembering the mentor who tried to steer him toward a better life. At Lenny's, There is regret and disbelief, a sense that this death in particular still does not make sense. With others, the tone hardens. Resentment at Micah, confusion at how it all went wrong, anger at Dutch's philosophy that promised freedom and delivered only shallow pits in the dirt. These remarks are not speeches. They are fragments, half confessions, a man talking to stones because there is no one left to argue back. Who hears them? Only the wind, the player, and a landscape that has already moved on. In that choice lies Rockstar's final statement about the Vanderlinde gang. Their legacy is not sealed in a triumphant epilogue or a grand memorial in some civilized square. Instead, it lingers in optional, silent spaces scattered across a map that no longer needs them. Riders pass by without noticing. History writes past as well. The graves remain, small interruptions in the grass, asking a question the game never answers outright. Were these people revolutionaries, criminals, or simply men and women crushed between freedom and civilization? The story does not end at the graves, though, because one last survivor is still trying to outrun those stones, and the world he rides into has its own opinion about who John Marston really is. John's epilogue is not just a new beginning, it is a walk through a ghost story. The legendary survivor of the Vanderlinde gang rides back along the same rivers, under the same cliffs, and finds that the past has not vanished. It lingers. Quietly, uncomfortably, Horseshoe Overlook is the first shock. From its humble beginnings as a bustling camp full of arguments, card games, and Dutch's speeches about freedom, it has become a hollowed-out stage after the actors have left. The fire pit is cold and ringed with blackened stones. A few crates, a broken chair, an abandoned bottle lie scattered in the grass, the living embodiment of evenings that once felt endless. There is no camp music now, no banter, no philosophy. Only wind, distant birds, and John's horse snorting in the silence. John does not say much, and that restraint is the point. His presence is the commentary. He rides through the empty clearing, slows, sometimes dismounts, and stands where the gang once slept and argued. The game does not need a monologue to explain what this means. The memory of Arthur's journal entries, of Dutch's promises, overlays itself on the landscape, and the contrast is brutal. A story of loyalty and betrayal becomes, in the truest sense, a story of absence. Clemens Point tells the same tale in a different key. The elegant bay, once filled with washing lines, children's laughter, and Hosea quietly reading, is now overgrown. Paths that were beaten flat by boots and wagons are half claimed by weeds. A tent has collapsed in on itself, canvas rotting, poles snapped. Scavengers have been here, boxes are overturned, valuables long since taken. The world was changing, and even thieves had been robbed by time. What does it mean to be a famous outlaw when strangers pick through the ruins of a life's work? Shady Bell is perhaps the most haunting. The decaying manor that once echoed with gunfire, whispered plans, and Dutch's increasingly desperate dreams now feels abandoned by history itself. Dust hangs in the light through broken windows. A few plates, a bed frame, a forgotten lantern remain in the corners where the gang tried to pretend they were still a family. The old ways were dying even then, in the echoing emptiness. That truth is impossible to ignore. These locations turn the player's own memory into a weapon. Every fire pit and collapsed tent invites the mind to project ghostly images of Arthur sharpening his knife, Sadie cleaning her rifle, Jack chasing fireflies. No cutscene spells it out, yet the emotional weight is undeniable. The legendary Vanderlinde gang, once a roaming myth of the West, has been reduced to a handful of forgotten campsites and a few scattered bones in the dirt. John rides through it all as both survivor and witness, a lost soul moving through the ruins of an idea, as the story edges closer to the harsher reality that awaits him on the far side of the frontier. John rides through ruins, but the world has already written the epitaph. From the very beginning of 1899, long before the last grave is dug, the gang's story is being printed, sold, and argued over on street corners. Every time a newspaper is bought after a key robbery or shootout, another layer of the myth is fixed in ink. Another version of events that quietly clashes with the gang's own memories. On the page, the Vanderlinde gang is not a family struggling for freedom. It is a headline. Dastardly outlaws terrorize Blackwater, gang of fiends slaughters lawmen, notorious Dutch Vanderlinde strikes again. These reports reduce complex choices to lurid spectacle, turning Hosea's careful planning into criminal cunning, Arthur's conflicted loyalty into brutish devotion, and John's attempts to provide for Abigail and Jack into nothing more than infamous Marston accomplice still at large. The world was changing, and the press knew how to sell that change. Bias seeps through every column. Witness accounts exaggerate body counts. Pinkerton spokesmen claim heroism while glossing over civilian deaths. When Cornwall's train is robbed, the paper emphasizes not his monopolistic cruelty, but the attack on honest enterprise, using the gang's violence as a convenient excuse to argue for more federal marshals, more private security, more barbed wire and telegraph lines. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, becomes, in print, a story of savages and saviors. Certain headlines are almost cruel in their framing. After the St. Denis bank heist, one edition screams cowardly murder of respected gentleman Hosea Matthews, turning a lifelong conman into a respectable victim only once he is useful as propaganda. Another praises Angelo Bronte as a pillar of the community shortly before his corpse is fished from the water. Who gets to be civilized, and who is branded outlaw, is decided in those cramped columns more than in any courtroom. Side by side with these scandalous reports sit articles about progress. New rail spurs in the heartlands, expanding oil fields near Annisburg, government projects promising order and prosperity. The old ways were dying, and the layout itself makes the point. Tales of outlaw raids are boxed in by stories of factories, stock prices, and land speculation, as if Dutch's entire philosophy is being squeezed to the margins by civilization. Dutch calls himself the living embodiment of resistance. The paper calls him a footnote in the march of industry. Over time, the tone hardens. Early issues treat the gang with a morbid curiosity, half fearful, half fascinated. By Beaver Hollow, that curiosity is gone, replaced by grim inevitability. Gangs capture only a matter of time, public demands stronger measures. The Van der Linde gang is no longer a question. It is a problem to be solved. Arthur's journal is the private history, written in doubt, regret, and fading idealistic hope. The newspapers are how the rest of America will remember them, or misremember them, long after the last campfire burns out. And as those clippings grow darker, another set of records begins to appear, pointing toward an even harsher verdict still to come. Those clippings are one record. The world's whispers are another. Between the ink on Arthur's pages and the headlines nailed to bulletin boards, there is a third chorus quietly building its verdict, the gossip drifting through saloons, train stations, and muddy street corners from Valentine to St. Denis. Listen long enough, and a pattern emerges. A ranch hand in the Valentine saloon repeats a half-remembered article about that Van der Linde outfit, insisting Dutch blew up a steamboat, even if the details are wrong. A shopkeeper in Rhodes complains that business is down because some damn gang scared the good folk off the roads, parroting the sheriff's words almost word for word. Townsfolk trade rumors the way gamblers trade chips, passing around lawmen's boasts and newspaper exaggerations, until the gang becomes less a family and more a campfire story. Dutch, who imagines himself the living embodiment of resistance to a corrupt civilization, is reduced in these conversations to a name on everyone's tongue. In St. Denis, a banker compares him to Butch Cassidy and a dozen other outlaws who thought they were different, filing Dutch neatly into a long list of men who tried to outrun progress and failed. Elsewhere, a drunk insists Dutch is some grand philosopher, while his friend shrugs and calls him just another bandit with pretty words. In the truest sense, the world was changing faster than Dutch's legend could keep up. Again and again, the chatter circles the same idea. The old ways were dying. A railway clerk boasts that with telegraphs and trains, there is nowhere left to hide. A traveling salesman in Valentine talks about Pinkertons using new records and centralized offices, promising that these agencies will clean out the last of the gangs before long. Even a pair of cowhands in the heartlands grumble that there is no room for wandering outlaws when barbed wire is fencing off the horizon. Their casual remarks sound small, but they are a story of freedom shrinking, of dreams colliding with steel rails and ledgers. Then comes the pattern interrupt that makes this world feel alive. Some of these voices are talking about events the player has already lived through. Rob the Valentine Bank, and days later 2 clerks whisper about those masked devils and argue over whether one of them limped. After the St. Denis trolley station chaos, a street vendor mutters that Dutch must be insane. While a bystander praises the police response, as if the gang's catastrophe were just another spectacle in the city's busy day. The gang sees a righteous crusade, the city sees a headline, and moves on. These throwaway lines, easily missed beneath piano music and wagon wheels, are from the very beginning Rockstar's quiet counter-argument to the Van der Linde myth. Where Dutch speaks in grand speeches about loyalty and family, the world answers with boredom, fear, and cold pragmatism. To most strangers, this is not a tragic epic. It is a problem to be solved. And as that indifferent chorus grows louder, another, more personal reckoning begins to take shape inside the gang itself. From the very beginning, the land itself is already telling the next chapter of the saga. The roads Arthur rides with a gang at his back are the same roads John will later ride alone, and Rockstar hides that tragic symmetry in fences, foundations, and forgotten names carved into the dust. Take Blackwater. In 1899, it is a town half built and half afraid, a frontier settlement trying to dress itself in the clothes of civilization. Construction scaffolds line the streets, the ferry pier still bears the invisible stain of the massacre, and Pinkertons linger on corners as the living embodiment of the new order. By the time John returns in Red Dead Redemption, those gaps are filled, the buildings are finished, and the power structures hinted at in RDR2 have fully hardened into banks, offices, and law. The same quiet foreshadowing runs through the ranches and forts scattered across the map. Pronghorn Ranch and Beecher's Hope in the RDR2 epilogue sit in a landscape that will one day be dotted with the small homesteads John visits in RDR1, the dream of freedom turned into fenced property and debt. Fort Mercer, a dusty ruin in RDR2's New Austin, already hints at the militarized stronghold it will become, its battered walls a story of the government's long reach, and the outlaws forced to shelter in its shadow. Families bridge the games as well. The McFarlands in RDR1 echo the smaller ranching families John meets in West Elizabeth and New Hanover, people whose lives are quietly warped by the Van der Linde gang's chaos. A train robbed in 1899 becomes a rumor in a saloon years later. A widow created by one heist becomes the desperate homesteader John will later help. Or fail. The fallout ripples outward, turning background faces in RDR2 into the unspoken history behind RDR1's side characters. Environmental change seals the connection. Towns expand, fields are plowed, telegraph lines march across the horizon. What once felt open and wild in RDR2 becomes crowded and controlled in RDR1, a visual reminder that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying. Burned-out shacks in RDR2 stand where thriving farms appear later, as if the land itself has been repossessed by progress. Is this modernization or a quieter form of conquest? John's own words drive the point home. In the epilogue, he talks about wanting an honest life, about putting away the gun, about building a home for his family. Those conversations at Pronghorn Ranch and Beecher's Hope are not just character moments. They are direct foreshadowing of the bargains he will be forced into with Edgar Ross, of the betrayal waiting in that final walk to the barn. In the truest sense, RDR2's closing hours are already a story of RDR1's beginning. Rockstar designs this world as a palimpsest, not a simple prequel map. Under every trail John rides in the first game lies the ghost of Arthur's horse tracks, Dutch's speeches, and Hosea's abandoned philosophy. The Van der Linde gang becomes the invisible prologue to every encounter in RDR1, turning that later journey into a haunted epilogue where John is forever riding through the ruins of his own past. And in those ruins, one last desperate dream is still waiting to be tested. And that dream, in the end, is not carried by Dutch or Hosea at all, but by something far quieter, ink on paper, passed on to a man who never reads it on screen. Arthur's journal is a story of a dying age trying to speak to the one that comes after, a bridge between an outlaw world built on dreams and a harsher world built on consequences. From the very beginning, Arthur writes to make sense of chaos, sketching Dutch as a visionary, the gang as a family, the frontier as a place where freedom still means something. By the time his hand begins to shake and the pages fill with cough-stained reflections, that tone has shifted. Dutch's speeches sound emptier, the promises thinner, the philosophy more delusion than destiny. In those final entries, Arthur turns his gaze away from Dutch and toward John and Jack, and the old ways were dying right there on the page. He draws John's family, writes their names, and, in the truest sense, signs over the last of his hope to them. Arthur stops describing John as a reckless younger brother and starts framing him as a final chance at something better. A man who might escape the cycle of loyalty and betrayal that destroyed the gang. Jack becomes more than a camp mascot. He is the living embodiment of a future that does not have to end in gunsmoke. Arthur's last written words about them read almost like a commission. Leave this life, protect this boy, build something honest out of all this blood. John never sits down in the epilogue and opens that journal. There is no neat scene of revelation. Instead, the game lets the weight of Arthur's unwritten wishes seep in through stories retold by Sadie, Charles, and even the silent presence of Arthur's grave. John feels what Arthur did for him in the space left behind, in the debts cleared, in the enemies already faced. The journal becomes a ghost script, and John's actions follow its invisible lines. Helping old allies, paying off what can be paid, raising a house beam by beam at Beecher's Hope, each choice in the epilogue can be read as John trying to honor a promise that was never spoken aloud. Is he becoming a rancher for Abigail and Jack? Or also for the dying man who dragged him out of the mud and sent him east? His new life is not clean, he still reaches for the gun, still feels the pull of the outlaw he once was. But every fence post, every plowed field, is a small rebellion against Dutch's grand, doomed rebellion. By the time John rides into Red Dead Redemption, that tension is hardened into suspicion. His reluctance to trust the government agents who hold his family hostage echoes Arthur's late-game realization that the system hunting them is just another version of Dutch's lies, dressed in a suit. Civilization demands obedience, Dutch demanded devotion, both tried to own his soul. John stands between them, a lost soul caught between freedom and civilization, trying to carve out a third path. In that sense, Arthur's hidden journal becomes the emotional script for John's visible story. One man writes the eulogy for the gang, cataloging every dream and delusion. The other is forced to live out its consequences, riding from grave to grave as the government turns his past into leverage. The pages Arthur filled with sketches of camps now abandoned, of faces now dead, hang over every choice John makes, even when no one mentions Arthur's name. And yet, for all that effort to change course, the world was changing faster than either of them could outrun it. The ranch John builds, the fragile peace he claws together, the fragile trust he places in a government that already sees him as expendable, all of it is heading toward a familiar cliff. Because there is one last Van der Linde lesson John has not fully learned yet, and Rockstar hides it not in a journal, but in the way his final stand is framed. Because that framing is the final echo of Dutch's great promise. Freedom, a man against the world, refusing to bow to civilization. But after seeing the entire arc of the Van der Linde gang, Dutch's rhetoric about freedom reads less as a philosophy and more as a plea, not for liberty in the truest sense, but for the right to live above consequence in a world that was closing that door. From the very beginning, Dutch insists they are fighting a rigged system, a corrupt government, a society built on exploitation. He speaks of freeing the poor, the weak, the forgotten. Yet every camp, from its humble beginnings in the snow at Coulter to the rot of Beaver Hollow, runs on money stolen from the very trains, banks, and rail companies that keep that system alive. Their dream of freedom is parasitic, feeding on the arteries of the same civilization Dutch claims to despise. The gang becomes a chosen family, a traveling utopian experiment pitched in canvas and campfires. Children are raised, meals are shared, songs are sung under the stars. In the truest sense, it feels like a refuge for every lost soul the world has chewed up. But the game's quiet details keep undercutting the romance. Ledger pages fill with jewelry, bonds, and stagecoach takings. Bounty posters multiply in post offices. Pinkerton patrols grow thicker on familiar roads. For every moment of warmth in camp, there is an unseen victim on a train platform or in a ruined town. The world was changing, and Rockstar makes that change tangible. Trains roar past more often. Telegraph lines web the horizon. Saint Denis hums with electric light and industry. NPCs gossip in saloons about mechanized farming, about oil barons, about the federal government tightening its grip. Modernization here is not just civilization, it is a new, impersonal form of control. A Marshall and Valentine can be bargained with. A Pinkerton with a file and a telegraph cannot. So was the gang doomed from the start, or simply aiming at the wrong enemy? Newspapers chronicle their crimes as colorful headlines, then as footnotes, then as moral lessons. After key missions, articles shift from breathless outrage to weary inevitability. The gang is already being turned into a story of caution and progress. Strangers in towns mention them less as people and more as legends, half-remembered outlaws already swallowed by the march of the modern state. Even the land forgets them. Camps vanish without a trace. New fences appear where horses once ran free. By the time John rides through New Austin, the Vander Linde gang has been absorbed, erased, repackaged as myth while the railroads and telegraphs roll on. That is the deeper tragedy. Their attempt to live free does not just fail. It reveals how little room there ever was for true freedom in the world they inhabited, and how that same world will do the exact same thing to the next man who believes he can outrun it. By the time John rides through a tamed New Austin, the legend of the Vander Linde gang is already complete. But Red Dead Redemption 2 is a story of how that legend is built, then quietly dismantled, one hidden detail at a time. From the very beginning, the game invites immersion in the fantasy. Around the fire at Horseshoe Overlook, Dutch holds court, the living embodiment of the noble outlaw, promising freedom, family, and a philosophy that makes every robbery sound righteous. Camp songs rise, bottles clink, bounties are bragged about. It feels, for a moment, in the truest sense, like joining a legendary band of heroes on the wrong side of civilization. Then the world starts whispering the cost of that dream. Those whispers live in places the main missions only glance past. Arthur's journal begins with rough drawings of Dutch and Hosea, full of admiration, of dreams that still seem reachable. Page by page, the handwriting sours, the sketches of Dutch grow harsher, the notes turn from praise to doubt to bitter resignation. Graves appear on lonely hillsides, each simple marker contradicting the gang's grand speeches about destiny. Newspapers in Valentine and Saint Denis paint them not as romantic rebels, but as dangerous criminals. And background conversations in town dwell on burned farms, orphaned children, and rising fear. The cracks in the legend appear first in private moments. A drunken Bill, slurring apologies for Blackwater. Javier, late at night, admitting he does not know what Dutch's philosophy really means anymore. Hosea, coughing in the dark, confessing that the world was changing and the old ways were dying long before Blackwater went wrong. Even Dutch, for a heartbeat on that balcony in Saint Denis, shows naked terror before the mask snaps back into place. Small acts betray them too. Micah bullying weaker men in camp. Pearson quietly slipping food to a starving stranger. Arthur choosing whether to help a sick outlaw on the roadside. Do these people look like legends, or just frightened, flawed men and women? Their spaces answer that question. From its humble beginnings at Coulter to the rod of Beaver Hollow, every tent is a confession. Dutch's area shifts from orderly, polished, almost theatrical, to cluttered and paranoid, maps and manifestos piled high as his delusions grow. Hosea's books and chessboard speak of a man who wanted a quieter life. Arthur's sketchbooks, cigarette cards, and worn satchel show a lost soul trying to understand the world rather than simply fight it. Even the way camp decor thins as money and morale drain tells a story missions never stayed allowed. By the end, the gang survives more in rumor than in flesh. Pinkerton reports, bounty posters, and campfire tales among strangers reduce complex lives to simple myths, traitor, madman, folk hero. History flattens them, as history always does. Rockstar wants that tension to be felt, to pull the audience between the allure and the hollowness of the outlaw legend, using the quietest details to whisper truths the gunfights try to drown out. And those whispers only grow louder in the stories told after the gang is gone. Those whispers do more than haunt the memory of a doomed gang. They echo the contradictions of an entire country. The Vander Linde gang is not just a band of outlaws on the run from civilization. In the truest sense, it is America's funhouse mirror, bending the nation's ideals until the distortion reveals their hidden shape. From the very beginning, Dutch's speeches about freedom and destiny sound eerily familiar. He talks about building a better world on the fringes, about resisting tyranny, about giving the poor and the broken a chance the system denied them. It is a story of rebellion and opportunity, of self-made futures carved out beyond the reach of the law. Is that not the same language heard in the country's founding myths, just traded from powdered wigs to blood-stained dusters? Yet in camp, the gap between philosophy and practice is impossible to ignore. Dutch insists everyone is equal, that the gang is family, that race and origin mean nothing under his banner. Charles and Lenny are welcomed, Tilly and Mary Beth are protected, and the gang shelters those the world has already written off as a lost soul. But leadership remains firmly male. Decisions flow from Dutch and Hosea, and the women do most of the cooking, cleaning, and quiet emotional labor. Protection for some, exploitation for many, a binary contrast that mirrors the country's own promises of justice stretched over a long history of exclusion. The world was changing, and the gang moves through its scars. At Clemens Point, they stare out at the husks of plantation houses, grand pillars now rotting. The old ways were dying, but their ghosts still rule the local economy. In Saint Denis, smokestacks and electric lights turn the sky black as Dutch rails against civilization while happily robbing its banks. In the heartlands and along the oil fields, the Wapiti and other native peoples are pushed aside, their lands sliced up by railroads and drilling rigs, while Dutch claims to fight for freedom on territories stolen long before he arrived. Their camps are pitched in the wreckage and construction sites of a nation redefining itself, one broken promise at a time. Even the world's reaction to the gang traces a familiar arc. Early on, bounty posters and fearful NPC chatter paint them as monsters at the edge of the map. Later, as the Pinkertons tighten their grip and the gang splinters, towns begin to talk about them in the past tense, as if they are already legends fading into rumor. By the time John wanders through New Austin, Dutch's Grand Crusade has become a collection of campfire tales and wanted posters curling on sun-bleached walls. Threat, then story, then footnote. Is that not how many radical dreams end? From its humble beginnings in Backley Cons to the final standoffs on cliffs and in canyons, the Van der Linde gang becomes the living embodiment of a question the country cannot stop asking. Who deserves to be free, and at what cost? Their hidden lore is not just about coded glances in camp or changing outfits in cutscenes. It is about a civilization that tells itself it is noble while stepping over the bodies that belief creates. And as the gang's trail grows colder, the land itself starts answering that question in a way Dutch never expected. The land answers quietly, in newspapers and gravestones, in worn blankets and half-burned campfires. The story of the Van der Linde gang is written there in the truest sense, not as a cutscene, but as a trail of objects, headlines, and overheard conversations that turn the game into a kind of history book. From its humble beginnings in the snow at Coulter to the rot of Beaver Hollow, every form of hidden storytelling has been laying out that history. Journals record the inner storms Arthur will never say aloud. Camp layouts shift from open, hopeful circles at Horseshoe Overlook to claustrophobic, defensive clusters in the caves. Character props tell on their owners. Dutch's polished pistol and tailored waistcoat early on, Micah's growing pile of weapons, Hosea's books and chessboard, Sadie's evolving gear, ambient dialogue in camp, and towns foreshadows betrayals before bullets ever fly, while newspapers quietly chronicle the gang's legend curdling into infamy. Graves at the end mark what the cross-game callbacks began, tying Red Dead Redemption 2 to the first game until the saga feels like a single, unbroken timeline. To read that history more fully, the pace of play must change. The missions tell one story, the world tells another. After a robbery or a bloody shootout, the most important scene is often the one that seems optional, lingering in camp as night falls, listening to who sings, who argues, who sits alone in silence. A player who rushes to the next objective will never hear the campfire confession that reframes an entire character, or the bitter joke that proves someone has already lost faith. There is another archive, less obvious but just as rich, the printed word. Every newspaper bought in Valentine, Saint Denis, or Blackwater is a new chapter in the gang's public legend. Headlines shift from tales of daring outlaws to panicked warnings and political spin, and each article quietly tracks how civilization decides who is a folk hero and who is a monster. Reading them in order, from the very beginning to the epilogue, turns the background into a running commentary on Dutch's philosophy and its collapse. Each tent, each bedroll, each corner of personal space is a character study. The living embodiment of a person's inner life is scattered there in bottles, books, photographs, and wear and tear. Javier's guitar resting ready, Bill's mess of bottles and ammunition, John's gradually more ordered belongings as he claws toward responsibility, Arthur's sketches and trinkets from strangers he tried to help. All of it charts arcs that no cutscene ever states outright. Even an empty space can speak. When a tent is abandoned, when possessions are left behind, betrayal and loss are written in what is missing. The wider world reacts as well, turning the gang's actions into moving history. Bounty posters multiply on town boards, law patrols grow thicker on familiar roads, and ambient conversations in saloons shift from curiosity to fear to exhausted anger. Who talks about the gang, what the headlines say, how heavily armed the law rides through Rhodes or Annisburg after key missions. All of it measures the shrinking room for freedom as the old ways were dying. Seen this way, Red Dead Redemption 2 becomes more than an open world. It becomes a layered historical document of a fictional outlaw family, written in a language of details that rewards slow, attentive play. And that language does not end with Arthur's last page. It continues into the epilogue, into John's homestead, into the graves on windswept hills, where the next set of clues waits in stone and silence. So when those pages end, when the ink dries and the graves stand silent, what remains is not just a game world, but a complete life cycle of a family written in whispers. From its humble beginnings, with two con men sharing a laugh in a bar, the Van der Linde gang traces a perfect arc from idealistic dream to inevitable ruin. The story begins not with gunfire, but with that first shared joke between Dutch and Hosea, two men who tried to rob each other and instead found a partner, a philosophy, and a cause. Dutch preached freedom, Hosea tempered it with caution, and together they became the living embodiment of a certain outlaw myth. When Arthur and later John were pulled in, half orphans and half criminals, the gang became, in the truest sense, a family built on chosen loyalty rather than blood. As the years passed, the campfires grew more crowded. Bill and Javier, Charles and Sadie, Abigail and Jack, even Micah slouching in at the end, all circled around Dutch's voice. Camps at Horseshoe Overlook and Clemens Point buzzed with music, chores, and easy confidence, their layouts open and generous. Tables piled high, lanterns bright. Yet from the very beginning, the world was changing. Newspapers in Valentine whispered about railroads and corporations, background conversations in Saint Denis scoffed at romantic outlaws, and every bounty poster quietly promised that civilization always pays its debts. Running beneath the missions, a second narrative unfolded. Arthur's journal shifted from admiring sketches of Dutch, framed in clean lines and hopeful words, to darker drawings where Dutch's eyes hollow out and the handwriting turns jagged. Dutch's own appearance followed the same slope, from slick hair, polished waistcoats, and flowers in his lapel to unbuttoned collars, dark coats, and a face swallowed by shadow. Micah's tent crept closer to Dutch's, his influence staining plans and language, while Hosea's corner of camp grew quieter, his books and chessboard gathering dust as his voice faded from Dutch's counsels. Every move of camp told the same story of erosion: Shady Bell's rotting walls, Beaver Hollow's claustrophobic caves, the way supplies grew scarce and laughter thinned. All foreshadowed that this philosophy could not survive the pressure of a closing frontier. Arthur's disillusionment hardened with each betrayal. John's reluctant resolve formed in the spaces where Dutch failed Jack. And when Hosea died in Saint Denis, the last restraint on Dutch's worst impulses died with him. Was there ever really a way back after that moment on the gallows platform? In the end, there is only distance. Distance between Dutch and his own ideals, between Arthur and the man who raised him, between John and the family he is desperate to protect. That distance ends in lonely graves, Arthur on a windswept hill, Hosea by the water, Lenny in an unmarked corner of a city that barely remembers his name, and finally, John on Beecher's Hope, buried under a simple stone as the epilogue to a tragedy that began decades earlier. Because Red Dead Redemption 2 does not stop at its own credits, it loops forward into Red Dead Redemption, turning both games into a single, continuous tragedy about men who tried to live by a myth in a world that no longer had room for it. Dutch's last stand at Cochenay, John's final walk outside his barn, even the way Blackwater and Armadillo have changed. All payoff details seated in campfire conversations, in Arthur's sketches, in the shifting routes of law patrols. In the end, Rockstar trusted players to become historians of this lost soul of the West. Every tent, every outfit, every scrap of paper, every grave is a clue, and when those clues are read together, they reveal the secret history of who these people truly were. Not legends, not slogans, but a family that tried to outrun history, and discovered that the old ways were dying long before the bullets started to fly. In the end, the lingering attachment to the Van der Linde gang does not come from believing they were flawless heroes. It comes from the unsettling realization that, from its humble beginnings to its bloody end, this was a story of people who felt painfully real. stumbling through a world that no longer had room for them. The world was changing. They were not. Around those campfires, in the quiet between shootouts and schemes, an outlaw family tried to hold itself together. The found family dynamic is not just stated, it is encoded into the smallest rituals of camp life. Pearson shouting about provisions, Miss Grimshaw enforcing order, Karen sneaking another bottle, John awkwardly tossing a ball with Jack, while Arthur sketches the scene in his journal. These are not grand cinematic moments, yet they become the living embodiment of a universal hunger, the desire to belong somewhere, with someone, even as civilization closes in. That is why the eventual fragmentation hurts so much. When Arthur's journal shifts from idealistic sketches of Dutch laughing at the fire to bitter, cramped lines about betrayal and delusions, it feels less like a plot twist and more like reading a private confession. When a grave appears on a hillside that was once just another hunting spot, when a tent stands empty and its little trinkets remain untouched, the loss becomes tangible. A chair out of place, a book left open, a coat never claimed again, the camp itself grieves. The hidden details transform the gang from archetypes into individuals whose absence lingers long after the credits roll. Javier humming a tune that will echo years later in Mexico, Bill polishing his guns in a corner that slowly fills with unpaid bounty posters. Charles quietly carving animals that mirror Arthur's own drawings. Even Dutch's evolving outfits, his hair growing wilder as his philosophy unravels, tell a story of a man slipping from conviction into self-justifying madness. These fragments make it impossible to dismiss them as simple villains or simple martyrs. There is a cruel tension at the heart of this saga. From the very beginning, the foreshadowing is everywhere. Newspapers predicting the end of the outlaw era, towns prospering while the gang's camps decay, Pinkertons circling closer with every move. The old ways were dying, and yet, each time Dutch unveils another plan, there is a flicker of irrational hope. Perhaps this score will work. Perhaps this family will finally find freedom. Perhaps loyalty will be enough. It never is. And that is where the story becomes, in the truest sense, a mirror. The gang's struggle reflects the way ideals harden into dogma, the way loyalty can become a chain, the way change arrives whether anyone is ready or not. Who has not clung to a fading dream, or stayed too long with a failing philosophy, because the alternative was admitting defeat? In that tension, the lore stops being distant history and starts to feel uncomfortably personal. Because the real question is not just how the gang fell apart, but what their ghosts still demand from those who remember them next. Their ghosts demand attention, and the world they haunt has already given the answers. The missions are only the spine of the tale. Perhaps 20% of the story at best. The real tragedy of Dutch's idealistic dream, the slow poisoning of that fragile sense of family, is written in the margins, in campfire whispers, in discarded letters, in the way a tent grows barer each time a believer walks away. From its humble beginnings, this was never just a sequence of shootouts and robberies. It was a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of freedom colliding with civilization until something had to break. The main missions show the break. The background details show the pressure building long before Colm's noose tightens, before Pinkertons ride through the fog. In the truest sense, the world itself is the narrator of the Van der Linde saga. Consider the camps. At Horseshoe Overlook, there is warmth, color, music, the living embodiment of Dutch's promise that everything will be all right. By Beaver Hollow, the candles burn low, crates sit half empty, and the walls close in. Every bottle on a table, every unpaid ledger, every abandoned book is a quiet prophecy. Who could mistake that for simple decoration once the pattern is seen? Arthur's journal alone contains a second hidden script. Early sketches of Dutch are bold, admiring, framed by confident handwriting that still believes in the philosophy. Later, the lines grow harsher, the words more bitter, as each betrayal carves itself into the page. A player rushing from waypoint to waypoint might never notice that an entire conscience is being documented in charcoal and ink. To walk this world again with a historian's eye is to discover how early the gang's fate is sealed. Linger in camp and listen as Javier's songs fade into tense arguments, as Susan's orders turn from domestic to desperate. Read every newspaper that quietly announces the advance of civilization, every bounty poster that reduces complex lives to a price. Treat every stranger's warning, every muttered insult in a saloon, as another footnote in the downfall of an outlaw family that never learned to adapt. This story does not belong to a single perspective. It belongs to anyone who has noticed a favorite journal entry, a haunting line of dialogue, a forgotten prop in a corner of Shady Bell, and realized it says more about Dutch or Hosea than a dozen gunfights. Let those discoveries be spoken aloud. Let the comments become a collaborative archive, a place where hidden lore is gathered before the world moves on. For those drawn to this deeper excavation, there is more waiting, the long shadow cast into Red Dead Redemption, character-specific analyses that follow John, Dutch, and even Micah through the years, further breakdowns of how Rockstar threads one continuous narrative through two games. Subscribes, likes, and returning to related stories keep this work alive, not as empty ritual, but as a way of saying the details matter. Because in this world, every outlaw dies twice, once in the bullets and once in the stories civilization chooses to tell. By paying attention to the smallest details, the old ways were dying a little slower, and the truest version of the Van der Linde gang is kept alive, if only for one more ride. So the ride does not end with the last bullet or the final grave. It changes. It moves from gunsmoke and gallows to quiet details and second looks, turning a story of outlaws into a story of how stories are told. The gang may be gone, but the world they move through is still speaking, in every half-heard conversation and every forgotten object left behind. From this point on, every open-world epic becomes more than a checklist of missions. It becomes a layered text, a living embodiment of its own history, where the most important truths hide in the margins rather than in the cutscenes. The next time a campfire murmurs in the distance or a stranger mutters about that gang up north, the question is simple. Is this just flavor, or is civilization quietly writing someone's fate in the background? For Red Dead Redemption 2, that means saddling up again as Arthur, but with new eyes. The tents at Horseshoe Overlook, the shifting clutter at Clemens Point, the decay creeping through Shady Bell and Beaver Hollow, each camp tells the same tragedy in a different dialect. Arthur's journal changes from idealistic sketches of Dutch as a hero to bitter, cramped lines that barely fit the page, and every altered drawing marks another betrayal that was already written in the world around him. Then the trail runs forward, not backward. After that second ride with Arthur, the story asks for another journey, into Red Dead Redemption, with John riding under a sun that feels harsher now. The graves on the hill, the ruined hideouts, the familiar towns that have moved on all press in, and every callback lands heavier. That burned-out cabin once held a family. That nameless ridge once held a philosophy. From its humble beginnings to its miserable end, the gang's shadow stretches across both games in the truest sense. Other writers deserve that same attention. Sadie's bloodstained path from widow to bounty hunter, Charles's quiet loyalty in exile, Javier's transformation from devoted lieutenant to hunted outlaw in Mexico. Each of them leaves traces in camp chatter, in small side missions, in the way their spaces are arranged and abandoned. Those are journeys waiting to be followed in full, and their hidden lore will have its own night by the fire, its own time under the lens. If most of these details slipped past on the first playthrough, that is not a failure. It is the design. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and the game was built to reward those who return to ride the same roads with different questions. This channel exists for that same reason, to circle back, to read what was missed, to guide each deeper dive into the dust and the margins. So picture the end. The campfire long gone cold, the journal closed, the grave still in the grass. The gang is finished, the myth is fixed. But somewhere a horse moves through the dark, an outlaw or a lost soul rides beneath a fading sky, and the story keeps going, as long as someone is still willing to follow the trail and press on for one more ride.